プログラム、1時から始まって、18時までです。その後懇親会を予定しています。でプログラムには書いてなかったんですけれども、有職者の方は2000円、学生の方は1000円ということでお願いしたいと思います。ただご招待の方はご招待です。それでまず私の方から、今回のシンポジウムの趣旨を説明します。申し遅れましたけど、私は女子立大学の原清と申します。よろしくお願いします。で、その後ディック・スナックマンさんが標準語についての理論的な話をしていただきます。でそれは英語です。英語ですが、日本語のレジュメが、外の方にあります。それを皆さんお持ちください。それを見ながら英語の話を聞いてもらうという形になります。で、車さんによるコメントがありますけれども、車さんは中国語にも堪能の方で日本語もできになるので、英語と日本語でやっていただきます。で、その後質疑応答は、そちらのパトリック・ハインリッシさんにお願いしています。ハインリッシさんも、いろんな言語に堪能の方なので、日本語と英語でやっていただきます。英語で質問が出た場合には、日本語に訳していただいてと。日本語で質問が出た場合には英語に訳していただいてという、大体でいいです。そんな形でやっていただきたいと思います。で、まずそれでは、開催趣旨のところをご覧いただきたいと思います。で、このシンポジウムは科学研究費によるプロジェクト、書記伝統における、標準規範の歴史的東西比較研究という非常に長い題名の、家庭技プロジェクトによる、シンポジウムです。で、第1回シンポジウムということになっています。ただ、このシンポジウムは、私が研究代表者を務めました前回の言語政策の東西比較という家計技プロジェクトがあったんです。それの延長です。で、その時にはすでに今回おいでいただいている、スー・ターミン先生、ジョ・ダイミン先生ですね、などはすでにご協力いただいております。ということで、前回のプロジェクトからの、継続の部分があるということにもなります。で、今回のこのプロジェクトの、一番肝心なところというのは、これは東西比較、つまりヨーロッパの伝統とアジア、主にアジアです、東アジアですけれども、の伝統を比較するという、できるかどうかわからないっていうか、なかなか大変なことをやろうとしているわけです。なかなか比較できるというか、そういうのがないかもしれないというか、そういうところがあるかもしれない。で、研究者も少ないというところもあります。で、なるべく広い視野を持った専門家の方々をお呼びして、討論を行いたいということがあります。で、今回は東アジア、それも近代に限っています。で、今回のシンポジウムにあたってはそちらにいますパオレンチュ、ホーさんがだいぶこのアレンジしていただいて、内モンゴルのバイルモントさん、あるいはモンゴル国からジャンデブさんとか、あとファンシー先生、など、おいでいただいています。それからヨーロッパからは、今年の6月に オランダの大連大学で、規範、言語規範ですね、プレスクリプティビズムに関する、大きなシンポジウムがあったんですけれども、それの、主催者の一人である大学のスマックマンさんに今回おいでいただきました。で、私そのシンポジウムに参加したんです。で、その時に、フロリアン・クルマスさん、日本ドイツ研究所の所長のクルマスさん、にお会いしました。街中でばったり会って夕食を一緒にしたんですけども、今回もおいでいただいております。お忙しい中、本当にありがとうございます。で、ということで、今回は東アジア、それも中国、モンゴルが主体になりますが、そこでヨーロッパを、比較の対象としてどこまでできるかということは、第1回なので、やってみようというところですかね。そんなところです。私の方はとりあえずこのぐらいの解説にしておいて、あとは、第1部の司会者パトリック・ハインリッシュさんから、スマックマンさんの紹介をしていただき、スマックマンさんの基調講演に入りたいと思います。それではよろしくお願いします。
ありがとうございました。東京大学のパトリック・ハインリッシュでございます。よろしくお願いします。ちょっと15分ぐらい遅れて始まりましたんですが、挨拶紹介は短かったですから、十分時間あります。Our first presenter today is Dick Smackman. Dick Smackman is lecturer at Leiden University, and he will talk about theories on standardization and how we change our views on standard languages. The title of his presentation, as I saw this morning, is slightly different than on the program. He will talk about the past, the present, and the future of standardization. Presentation will be in English. Discussion comment afterwards can be in Japanese as well. What else should I say? Dick Smackman is currently co-editing a book on globalizing social linguistics. So he's looking at a variety of regions and languages, and he has therefore knowledge which is larger than that of Europe. So please, Dick, the floor is yours. よろしくお願いします。
Can you hear me? So today I'll be talking about language standardization, history, effects, approaches, and future. It's a very long subtitle. My name is Dick Smackman. I'm from Leiden University, and this is Leiden University. So Leiden University was founded by William of Orange, who was the founder of the Netherlands. And as a present to the Netherlands, he gave us a university, which is a great present. Nowadays, it's the oldest university, and it's very much associated with the topic of today. It's associated with, Dutch as a national language, which needs to go forward. This is a modern teaching building, which could have been anywhere in the world, I suppose. This is the old academy building, and this is the building where I work. And this would be my office, and this will become relevant because this is where, so that's really next door, 3 seconds. This is where the spelling of the Dutch language more or less takes place. This is where the famous people are who are discussing the topic of spelling and which way to move forward and which you know, what is the standard language? It's also the part where historical Netherlandic studies takes place. So it's all very close to home. The standardization of the grammar of the Netherlands of Dutch is more associated with the University of Nijmegen, which is other side of the country, but that's only 150 kilometers. So together they are in charge of the Dutch language, you could say. We're talking about standard language as a phenomenon, what it is, about the past, and about some principles. Then I'll discuss how certain policy issues which take place, certain decisions are taken on grammar and on spelling in the Netherlands, but also in the English language. And I'd like to demonstrate what actually happens in the lives of ordinary people like you and me, or ordinary people like you and me without the linguistic knowledge, and how it really affects us in our daily lives. And then after that, I would like to take that as a point of departure to discuss what to do with this knowledge about what happens in our daily lives. My perspective is obviously default very Western, and I wouldn't say that I represent the West, but you know, underneath there are these Western assumptions, and it's about Dutch, which is really one of the smallest countries in the world. It's in a way insignificant, but I hope that my sort of Western views might, you know, enlighten you, and maybe you can draw some comparisons and maybe tell me off about certain things, which I might, all kinds of assumptions that I might get wrong. So about standard and standard language. There are all kinds of definitions of what this phenomenon actually is. If you look at Macmillan Dictionary, standard means generally used and accepted as normal. And normal is of course an awful word, but this would be a description of just the word standard without standard language. Then if you look at the OALD, standard is believed to be, which suggests that there is a consensus, believed to be correct and used by most people. And most people to me would be 51%, and this is not really a realistic approach if you look at the standard language, because most people, they don't speak the standard language if you take it as a strict phenomenon, which has little variation. And of course, the well-known argument by Jespersen, one of the first in the Netherlands, this is a big argument, it's regionally neutral. Haugen, another famous person, talks not in terms of the features of the language itself, but more of the stages that a certain language goes through in order to become something else, due to all kinds of forces, so that on the basis of that you can call it the standard language, and that's irrespective of what it's like intrinsically, linguistically. So this is a time argument. Stewart looked at all kinds of features that the language will have gone through or will have adopted in its life, and after that you can call it a standard language if it meets these criteria. It's an approach that not many people here would apply probably. It's the language contact approach, that the standard language is something which naturally comes to existence through language contact. But of course, from our point of view, the stage, at some point in this natural standardization stage, people come in and they start meddling with that phenomenon, which is naturally already moving in a certain position, certain direction, and it's taking it and then doing something with it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And Crystal simply said, it's the prestige diet. Now if you look at all of these features of the standard language, and then very few could actually be combined and still make sense. So generally used or regionally neutral or correct, they all, in a way, they contradict each other. And that's actually a problem from a theoretical point of view, because if you're talking about standard language and standardization, then you need to know what it is that you're talking about, what the phenomenon is. Lass, in 1987, very conveniently, looked at it from a more practical point of view. He said that standard language is a high-prestige dialect, that's how we do business, that's how we write our books, and this is what we teach children with. And we teach them in that language, and we teach them that language, especially if it's not their first language. Now, this is actually, the point of departure there is, that's today's point of departure. The ideas surrounding this, these assumptions that this is the right way, started in the Middle Ages when, well, in the Netherlands and in all over Europe, there would be a continuum of dialects because the national borders were simply not there. The national borders between the Netherlands and Germany are relatively recent. So there were dialects, and in these dialect areas, there would be monks who would write in Latin first, but at some point they wrote in their regional version of Dutch, and they had no idea what the standard language was. There was no standard language, and even in England they would just write whatever they thought was correct, and that's how it slowly came to be. Education was in the local dialect, inevitably. Then came the nation states in Europe, and today you could say that if you look at a map of Europe, which we will in a few seconds, there are some very strong and powerful standard languages. The national borders are absolute linguistic borders also. And again, this is relatively recent. The dialects, they cross the border, but the standard languages, they absolutely stop at the border. And so it's all very neat and fixed, you could say. So what is standardization? Christo said that it's a natural development in a speech community of a standard language, or an attempt by a community to impose one dialect as standard. So you have here again the natural development, and then people meddling with it. Hudson took the meddling approach a little bit further and said it's a direct and deliberate intervention by society to create a standard language where before there were just dialects. So it's a very unnatural language, and I've done research into standard language, and directly or indirectly people refer to the standard language as intrinsically unnatural. And that's because of the history, of course, of this particular language form. One could say that one needs to standardize. If one standardizes, one does it for all kinds of reasons. It helps communication. It's a unified form to pass on information from one person to the next, from one generation to the next. You can, if it's a topic, if you know what the standard language is, then you can discuss it. If you don't know what it is, then you don't know what the topic of discussion is. That will be unpractical. It helps literature. If we all read each other's books and write in the same way, then it helps the quality of the literature. And it also helps us to, if a standard language comes to existence and it stays the same, so the changes are suppressed, then that gives today's generation easier access to older literature. So it's really, although you could say that it's an unnatural phenomenon, it's also a beautiful phenomenon, which is very culturally enriching. I think it's a good thing that standardization takes place, as long as substandards or regional dialects are not suppressed too eagerly. So standardization policy is a political and other measures to promote or regulate the language or elevate its status. So you want it to be considered to be better than other languages. This is sort of a natural tendency that's typical of the standard language. There are many goals. You can standardize to, the policy could be aimed at creating unity in a country. In the Netherlands, this has been very important. I'll show you the map and then you'll see why it's very important. It's for national identity. It can be used for reform, conservation of the language, the culture and literature, for modernization, getting ahead in the world. If you speak a big language, that actually helps you. And if that's a unified language, then it could become an international language. The Dutch tried, but we never managed, unfortunately. It also makes things simpler if we all speak the same language, and terminological unification is helped by standardization. The point of departure is that if you speak the standard language, you are more likely to be more successful. And we all know that the most successful people in all of your countries, they don't speak with very broad dialects, which are difficult to understand. So, teach your children the standard language, and they are more likely to get ahead in life. And it's good for the economy, etc., and personal development. Policy may help if you have a situation where the political and national and linguistic borders do not seem to coincide. And then you could say, on this side of the border, or the geographical or other border, we speak this language, and on the other side we don't. And that makes things a little bit simpler, so that people know where they belong. It can also be, the ideology behind it could be all kinds. Perhaps the most common one is where you have one country and one language, but there are many examples, especially in Africa, for instance, where this would be absolutely impossible. And if you impose this, then there would be war. It would be very difficult. Or you could say, no, we want to preserve pluralism, which would be typical of South Africa. You have all these languages, and you want to give every inhabitant belonging to some ethnic or linguistic group the idea that they are part of this country. And standardization of several languages parallel would help this. So in South Africa you have many languages. Today there's 2 official languages, but of course there are many more languages spoken there. And standardization policy in this country is very idiosyncratic. It's very unique, and the policy makers need to take this into consideration. And for us, maybe we should try and understand that it's not always the same motivations behind policy which are active. After apartheid, so first there were 2 official languages, and after that 11 official languages. It's a large country, but still 11 official languages is quite a lot. And as an outsider, so as a Westerner, this seems to me like a form of political correctness. You could say, well, you could go too far and just accept everything as a standard language, but not all of these languages, they receive the same financial or political support. So in a way, they're not that equal, and really English is the most dominant language, and Swahili. And India has many languages, many dialects, became independent after colonialism, and Hindi and English are now the official languages. And again, a very unique situation, and they deal with their own problems. And standardization, unlike in a country like the United States or England, it's a sort of, it's serious business. In the Netherlands, it's not really serious business because we don't seem to have any language problems, but this is a serious problem. There's Indonesia. I won't go through it, all of it in detail, but again, many languages, and then you have the, the history of Indonesia, that they have anti-Dutch feelings these days, and you can see, if you go to Indonesia, the history with Dutch, the Netherlands, so this used to be our colony for a few hundred years, and they don't dislike the Dutch, but they just don't want Dutch to be everywhere. And the policy is therefore towards, one language. They have thousands of islands, but they want one language to unify the country, and then having an policy is part of that policy, if you like. There's also the Basque region in Spain, which is officially, it is Spain, but it crosses the border, and there is, since the 1960s, there has been some regional standardization, and they have a completely different approach to things because there were 4 different dialects. They were dominant dialects in a very small area, and they tried to create a new dialect, a standard dialect, on the basis of the existing language input that was there. So we all have our own approach. Now, the original motivations to standardize were to solve problems. In Africa, in Asia, South America, grammars were needed and dictionaries were needed for indigenous languages. You need to write down the language, you need to form a nation. So the standardization was not a luxury, it was a necessity. There were people in the area that might not feel that they are part of the country, and they wanted to, the government wanted to suppress this separatism by just imposing the language, sending those children to the right schools, and a little bit of force here and there. And another reason to a sort of puritanical approach to standardization would be for the language to reflect history. So the language gives you insights into, that it reflects, that it shows what your history is like, that it really is a representation of your culture and history. And it could also enhance authenticity. Today, there is a less practical need and more symbolism. And maybe this is a little bit Western, because like in the Netherlands or in the other Western countries which I've mentioned, there's not really a practical problem. So in the Netherlands, it's a tiny little country, but there is a language variation, but everybody in the Netherlands speaks this one language as a native tongue or as almost a second language, but whenever somebody opens their mouth, the other person will always understand. So it's become more of a luxury, which means that in such countries, standardization is now really about discussions about the nitty-gritty details of language, which somehow don't seem to matter anymore, but that's where we've ended up. We've solved all problems, and all we focus on are theoretical, practical little details which have nothing to do with communication. For instance, how do you pronounce the phoneme G as h, or h? They're all understandable, but this is what we'd like to discuss. That shows the luxury of standardization in our country. So, for a standard language to be successful, there are certain requirements. It should be supralocal and widely comprehensible. It should be, people should like it. They should be able to say, well, if I speak that language, I will look good in social condition, in social situations and in professional situations, and it's good for me. It shows that I have certain features like good education, etc. A requirement for success is also codification. It should be written down. If you have no written language, then you have nothing. You can't just have a spoken language and pass it on as an oral tradition. That's not realistic. There should be consensus on what the standard language is, and also who decides. So if there is variation, or if there's questions to be answered, we need to know who decide on what is correct and what is incorrect. You also need official academies, and those would be, if there is an official academy, those would be the ones to decide. And then you could ask yourself the question, who should be, or who are, traditionally, in these official academies. There is, for instance, the Bulgarian Academy, 19th century, relatively recent. There is this is probably, I would say, the most well-known academy, Académie Française, French, and in the Académie Française are, I once saw, this is very hard to penetrate. These people are elitist people, and you don't know who they are, but they are very old people. And I saw an interview once with one of them, and the question was very simple. There is Basque And there are other regional dialects which are very spoken by many people, and they also speak French, but what about those languages? And the very old man said, this is not my business, it's not French. This is a very extreme view of, a very puritanical way of looking at language. There is a Spanish official academy and a Swedish one. I only picked that for the name because I find that funny. Smack means good taste, I hope. Snille och smack. So we all have one, and the Netherlands, we have one too. And I don't know if all countries have one, to be honest, so you would have to enlighten me in that respect. But they all have different ways of looking at things. So the Haugen model, which I just discussed, was developed. It's the most well-known. It's also the one most referred to. There is a problem. It's from Norway. Norway is not representative of anything but Norway and perhaps Scandinavia. It's also old, and it's based on all kinds of Norwegian assumptions. Standardization, from the point of view where you start with selection and then acceptance codification and then elaboration, and of course they're not consecutive stages, they're all going on at the same time. But this is the traditional way of how a language is formed. First there are dialects, then one of the dialects becomes dominant for economic reasons, usually in the West, and then slowly people start writing it down, and then you start spreading the linguistic gospel, and people start learning it, and it becomes the national language. This may not fit all countries anymore. So, if you look at all these stages, and you go to England, for instance, there are Haugen stages and some extra intermediate stages, and you can see in the history of standardization, for instance, in this country, England, that there was selection of a certain dialect. In retrospect, we can conclude this. It wasn't as if somebody said, let's pick. It was really hundreds of years later when it was realized that this had taken place. There was acceptance, there was a spreading through the churches, there was the printing, of course, which was the most important factor in standardization ever, still. And there was elaboration of its function. So Latin used to be the dominant language, but English more or less took over in England. This is, of course, an important step that monks and important people stopped speaking anything but English or a local variety. And there is codification and prescription. And today we have usage guides, and all languages in Europe seem to have these usage guides, and some of them are actually bestsellers, especially the ones that are easy to read, because they talk about, this is one, they talk about what is right and what is wrong in language, and somehow people always seem to be interested in this very, very much. Before we move on, in the beginning, this was actually the end of my presentation, but it seemed to fit in better just to give you that information, because it sort of reflects on what comes next. Joop van der Horst is a Dutch historian, historical linguist. He asked himself the simple question, are we at the end of standardization? Not just the standardization process, but the end of the phenomenon of the standard language as something which we have achieved. He said that recent changes in Western standard language constitute change of language and culture. So we see around us that linguistically and in society, things are very, very restless. There's change. You would expect to, so 50 years, if you'd ask people, they would have said, well, in 2013 we'll have a fixed standard language and we can move on. But instead, another movement seems to be taking place, that we're moving slightly away from the standard language. The idea that there is an end to standardization started, it's sort of Renaissance thought, which Joop van der Horst claims has only relatively recently, i.e. very late, been abolished, in the sense that, you know, we're trying to get rid of the idea, this is a sort of change from below, we're getting rid of the idea that all change should come from above, and that, you know, the ordinary users can't have a say anymore. For instance, if you look at English, there's a book called Standards of English, and again, 50 years ago, if you'd asked what will be the next world standard, well, that would be British or American English, maybe more likely American English. Today, the situation is that British English has slightly more status, but the real standard in the world is American English. But now that these standards are becoming so strong, and as a result of these standards becoming very dominant, the Australians also said, well, now we want a say as well, because we are a culture, we exist, and we will have our own grammar. So this is a move away from a world order of a world language order. And there's American English, and even also Scots, Irish English, and Australian English it has its own standard, and you can't impose any British English or American English standard on any Australian. So the idea of one world language being the inevitable outcome of standardization is not realistic anymore, because people just start to complain. So let's go to the Netherlands. This is the Netherlands, and what is striking about the geographical position of the Netherlands is that the Netherlands is stuck between a big language called German, a big language called French, and English. So we're a little bit, we've never been part of any other country. We were always a separate country, and we have a very long standardization history. It might be this strong because, for instance, we have the largest dictionary, which will take up a whole bookcase in the world. So we have, it's a historical dictionary, and the Dutch one is bigger than any other dictionary. It might be because we were surrounded by such dominant languages and very dominant cultures that we thought, you know, we need to establish ourselves. And of course, the other threat is the sea, because every few hundred years the sea tries to wash away the country. So there's been a sort of, you know, the idea that we should preserve the country and the language is very, very strong in this, in the Netherlands. And you can assume this to be similar in all these countries which are also outside, which are also in Europe. This is the Netherlands. I've made it look a little bit bigger, but it's still only 200 kilometers. The Netherlands, this is the border between the Netherlands and Flanders. This is Belgium. Flanders is the northern part of Belgium. They speak Dutch here. It's a different type of Dutch, but we have the same grammar, and we have the same dictionary. Dutch language policy is usually for the whole area. Here you can see, on the basis of measurements, the language variation. So this would be, the red is the standard language, and anything further away from red would be linguistically, on the basis of linguistic changes needed to be made from one variety of the language to the next, phonetic changes. This reflects how language variation in such an extremely small country is still very much alive. So I will recognize an accent from, so I'm from here, and I will recognize an accent from slightly above there. I would recognize it straight away. So 50 kilometers could be a new dialect, even 20 kilometers. So very strong still. We have a Dutch grammar called the Algemene Nederlandse Spraakkunst, and roughly translated, this would be the general Dutch art of speech. You can feel the pride in this title, I think. It has many pages. It is, interestingly, it's descriptive rather than prescriptive. Most rules are not subject to much variation, but much of the book is spent on all kinds of variation which exists in society. And then the book says, well, you know, there is one way which one could be considered to be correct, but all the other ways, they also exist, and we should actually do something with it. And what the book has said is very interesting, and I'll show you through an example. The personal pronouns in Dutch, hen and hun, plural, they, of course, the plural third person is something you use in every conversation. It's very frequent, but there's much variation in its use. So the direct object says that it's, if you say I saw them, it should be hen. I give them, the indirect object, it's hun. It's a very simple rule that we should apply. But if you go to the Netherlands, then you will not hear this correct version very often. You will hear it amongst people with good educations who were told that this is the rule. But in people, very intelligent, normal people, and even academics that I meet every day, they won't stick to this rule, and they don't know the rule. I see them, they give to them, would be 3 ways to use them. And I've written down what I think, and this is intuition as a native speaker, an intuition of a hierarchy of acceptedness and status of various ways to say, I see them, they give them, and they give to them. Now, first of all, there would be this one. This is the correct version. I would never say this. My PhD was on Dutch. I'm a Dutch language expert. The reason I know this is because a few weeks ago, when I really started to present this presentation, I thought I really should look up the rules so that I don't make any mistakes. And I'm glad that none of you speak Dutch as well as I do, because you might say, well, you know, I'm not sure this is correct. But I looked it up. This is correct. This is another way of saying it. Ze zien hen, ze geven aan hen. So you see the green is the hens, the blue is the huns, and ze is the object, which also shows variation. This is, to me, equally common. Because you see that they're just saying, I'm just going to pick one of them, the hen, and use it always. That's easy. You see hen, hun, if you don't distinguish, that's more difficult. Or you just turn it around completely, but this to me is completely normal. It's incorrect, but it's completely normal. So moving down, this is becoming a little bit awkward here, but I have been known to say this. I have said it. Just hun everywhere. Hun is also, people think that it's an ugly way, an ugly word for some reason. But some people might just say it, because it's a simplistic approach. And there is another one, just put in ze everywhere and think, well, maybe that's, then there's no rule whatsoever. You always use the same one, but a different one which is neither hen nor hun, so you don't make that mistake. And there is hun as a subject, which people hate. But I was told off for doing this at the age of 25. I remember, because it was really painful. Because my professor said, you are a hun person. And then I stopped doing it. So now I try and pick the form as high as possible, but this one, I really can't. I wouldn't be able to teach it. And I was a teacher of Dutch, but it's just very difficult. So what to do with this variation? This is the most prestigious one. These are equally common ones, and we should do something with this variation, at least. Now, the official Dutch rules, which I will not read out, but they're here. And they're very difficult. I can assure you, I will not teach any Dutch. But the official Dutch rules are in the official Dutch grammar. The grammar says, it doesn't say, do this but don't do that. It gives you all the nuances, all the grey areas, all the uses, and says, this is slightly more acceptable there in certain circumstances. If it's not stressed, then you can use this. Ze is more informal. It gives you that information. So the official Dutch grammar gives you information on formality, register, usage, stress, etc., etc. But at the same time it says, in the written language, this is correct. it gives you these rules. So it distinguishes between the written language and the spoken language, and by writing down what the spoken language is, it also embraces and accepts the spoken language as a very important phenomenon. There are some issues which any linguist would not be able to deal with, but there is an intrinsic status of the word hen. If you say hen as an object, that makes you look really intelligent. Okay? So some people just always use hen, which means that half the cases it's incorrect. But there's an intrinsic status of this word. There's different degrees of acceptability in written and spoken language, and increasingly, hun, even as an object, so the word hun, which everybody considers to be, well, educated people consider to be ugly, it's growing. Hun geven aan hun is becoming increasingly ugly. Those of you who have, some of you have learned Dutch, maybe 10, 20 more years ago, you will probably find this really odd, and I could tell by your faces just now. So, but it's growing. If you don't like it, then don't go to modern Netherlands. So, policymakers need to do something with this, or not. Abdulaziz said that spelling is an efficient and practical tool which enables education and cultural and administrative actions and mass media systems. And so we've dealt with grammar. Let's look at spelling. And this would be how I would look at spelling as well. It should be practical, you should be able to use it, and people with any degree of education, you know, an average degree of education, should be able to apply it and use it functionally for all these actions that they can undertake. Now there are 4 spelling principles, and I know that if you ask Dutch people, what is the principle of spelling, then they will correctly say that is phonetic. You know, you have sounds, and each sound you put it into a letter, and you put the letters in the right order, and then after that, strange things happen because you can't put all sounds into letters, because otherwise it would have to be phonetic, and language changes, and then slowly the pronunciation and the spelling, they start moving away from each other. But of course, besides this phonetic principle, there is the logographic principle, syllabic principle, the consonantal principle. When I was in Kyoto 12 years ago, I think, that I found that in Japan there were several ways of referring Westerners to the toilet. And up to this day, so these are pictures I took. This is Nara, this is Kyoto. And for this one, I hope that it's just a typo. So I think this is theoretically not very interesting. But the other one, lavatory, for lavatory, I find that really interesting. It was funny, but it's also interesting because you can ask yourself, are they applying a phonetic principle to a language which is not really, which doesn't apply this system? So I would like you to tell me, maybe in the discussion afterwards, what the rationale was behind it. You see, if you ask me to write something down in an exotic language in the Netherlands, then I would check 10 times, and I would ask native speakers, because I don't want on my sign I don't want there to be any mistakes. But this shows a certain liberal attitude and maybe a sort of a phonetic principle. But I would like you to educate me in this sense. Not about this one, we'll just forget about that one. Dutch spelling has just disappeared from my screen. Behind the black is an overview of boxes. Let's see if it's actually... My boxes have disappeared. But there's an overview of boxes, and the boxes they contain names and dates, years, starting in the 17th, 18th century, when Dutch spelling started, the 19th century. It started in the 19th century, and in that time, the Netherlands and Flanders and our relationship with South Africa were also developing. Every few years, every few decades, there was a new spelling system. So there would be an enforced new spelling system, and sometimes the changes were quite radical. And there's also been a point where there were two parallel systems. And the last spelling changes were in 1995 and in 2005. And I will tell you about certain small changes that were proposed, which in a way have very sort of awkward and dramatic effects in daily life. This is the Dutch Académie Française, if you like, the Dutch Language Union, and they look after our language, and there's a consensus that they do. So we've all agreed that we are fine with them looking after it. And as I said, it's strongly associated with Leiden University. This is the green booklet, and the reason it's called the green booklet is simply because it's green. There's no rationale behind it. It's traditionally green, so we call it the little green book. And it contains a list of all Dutch words, if that's possible. This is the 1945 version. This is the one today, and people know this. Everybody knows this. Now, this is the in the beginning of the book. It has certain features. It is commissioned by the Dutch and Belgian governments, so it's official. It's got many spelling rules, and it has a list of 100,000 words, which we are supposed to know as native speakers. So it's huge. And the green booklet, it has a standardized spelling, and it is, unlike the, as you remember the grammar, unlike the grammar, it is prescriptive. Spelling is never descriptive. No spelling expert will say, well, you can write it this way, or you can write it that way. But in the past, it was more descriptive, and in 1995, it became prescriptive. For instance, the letters C and K, they both represent the sound K. There's been changes made and people have decided, the Dutch Language Union have decided that it should be one or the other. The Institute for Dutch Lexicography in Leiden has made the green booklet. This is it, this is their logo. And in their logo is, other words, the treasure house of Dutch lexicography, which again shows, you know, all the pride that is put into it, or that it has. And every year, just to demonstrate how important Dutch spelling is to Dutch people, every year in December, and this has been like that for about 20 years, there is the National Spelling Contest on television, where people sit down and two newsreaders, they read out a text of 300 words, and then famous people and non-famous people, they do the test real time whilst it's being read out, and you know, we are all very excited about the National Spelling Test. And the winners are, on average, in the last 20 years, they have about 4 or 5 mistakes. The winners, so the absolute elite of spelling in the Netherlands, they have 4 or 5 mistakes in 300 words. I must admit, these texts are ridiculously difficult. Okay, they're not your average text, no one speaks like that. All the difficult words that exist are in that text. But on average, between 13 and 39 mistakes, that would be the range of the last 20 years. And that's a lot of mistakes, which means that, you know, we don't know how to spell sometimes. And just to give you an example of a spelling issue, there is the English word appeal, we also have it in Dutch, and it is pronounced appel. So in 1954, the spelling was appel. And because the stress is on the second syllable, most people would just add the accent grave, which is a stress sign. So in 1995, it was decided that because people do this, it's also acceptable. But then in 2005, I don't know if these were the same people, they decided, no. Because in French, it's a French word, and French doesn't have it. And also, it's a rare word, and you can always tell from the context which word it is. So you know that the spelling is on the second. So they got rid of it again. So now it's appel without the stress sign. Now, if you go to the Netherlands and you say this word to Dutch people, to 100 Dutch people you ask them, what do these letters mean? A-P-P-E-L, then 99 of them will say, it's an apple. It's one of the most common words. And one of them will say, yes, it's apple, but it's also appeal. Okay, but to me, this would never be appeal. I would need a big context before I knew that this was an appeal. So we have appel and appel with exactly the same spelling, and the decision has been made officially that they should have the same spelling. So it's become more confusing, but it's more in line with theory. It's more logical. But ordinary users don't find this very attractive. There is a Dutch political party called the CDA, and it's called the Christian Democratic Appeal. And this used to be their sign, appel. You see it? And today, this is their sign. It's a Christian Democratic apple. Okay. To me, if you ask my father to read this out, you would have to tell him, say appel, because it actually says apple. And it's a really awkward change that has been imposed on us, and nobody takes it seriously, and I refuse to leave out the e. You just don't do that. Moving from apples, I'd like to go to apple pancakes, which, if you apply this spelling, would be called an appeal pancake. So on the menus, it will say appeal pancakes these days. This is an apple pancake. And apple pancakes are very Dutch. When I say apple pancake, in the same sentence, or as a sort of, I don't know, as an association of apple pancakes, I would give you this. I associate apple pancakes with this, very Dutch, and with wooden shoes, clogs, and with tulips, and cows, and cheese. So apple pancakes are very, very Dutch. So as a spelling reformer, if you touch our pancakes like this, you are touching our culture. It's a cultural attack. So the apple in apple pancake was affected by the spelling changes. Another change that they made was in the rest of the word, of this compound, in where pan goes to cake. Pannenkoek. In the pronunciation, there is a schwa. Pannenkoek. Pannenkoek. You can hear that I don't say pannenkoek, but the spelling officially these days is pannenkoek. And I'll explain later. But here's a pancake house. They sell pancakes because it's a specialty. And you can see that they have a version, their old sign. It's very expensive to change them because you actually have to change the name of your company. You have to pay money to do that. The old sign says pannenkoeken without the N, but then the new sign, which has the latest offer of pancakes, it has pannenkoeken. So it's a little bit silly and uncomfortable what's happening. The pronunciation has a linking schwa. It has a. Both en and s are associated with the plural in Dutch, just as a bit of information which is necessary to understand what's coming. So pan is singular and pannen is plural, and sometimes the plural is formed with an s, like English. The Green Booklet of 1954 said that if there's one pan, then you can leave out you can let it depend on how many pans you use to make the pancake. Okay, that's the rule. It's logical. It's a culinary theory, if you like, practical theory. But the Green Booklet of 1995 says this. Use en where the first part of the compound is a noun that has en and not s as a possible plural, and if both plural exist, then add an n. This is a very difficult rule. So you don't look at the actual pancake and how many pans you have, but you apply several rules in order to find out what the spelling is. So Dutch students, before the rule was, well, how many pans do you use? 1, okay, no N. But nowadays, we have to learn this. This is in Dutch, but you can see that it's difficult. So if you say, I'm going to eat a pancake, then first in your mind, mentally, you have to go through all these rules before you write it down, and then you can write it down, so it's become very difficult. So the problem with these two rules that I've just explained is that they are, in a way, a cultural attack. It would be like me asking you, telling you, well, I've looked into the etymology of the word kimono, and your spelling is wrong, please change it. And then you will say, no, 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 don't touch our kimonos. This would be your sort of cultural defense system. And it's similar here, it's cultural attack. The other problem is that only teachers know this rule. It's also illogical, because pannenkoek to me would be Pan's cake. It's awkward, so it's not, it's counterintuitive. There's also a problem here, is that the spelling was changed because the line of argumentation was changed. So if you use a line of argumentation for one spelling, you should also use it for another, but they changed the line of argumentation. But that's like playing volleyball, and then if the ball is too low, you kick the ball into the net, and you say, goal, because now we're playing football. That's what they've actually done. They've just changed the line of argumentation. It's also a set of consecutive rules, not just one simple rule, but you have to apply several before you know. The wishes of common users have been more or less ignored because what common users want is simplicity and clarity. They don't think that it should be, you know, etymologically, historically, and logically correct. They just want to be able to say it and write it down. It leads to the adoption of words as a lexical item. So if I say pannenkoek if I write down pannenkoek these days, I would just say, oh, it's plus N. And again, the reason I know the rule is because I looked it up for this presentation, because I didn't know the rule. I just write down that word with N. And similar words with N, and I guess that it's okay. So that's problematic. And it's not in accordance with pronunciation, because you don't say pannenkoek, but pannenkoek. So to me, and this is my personal opinion, this the spelling principles are a little bit, they're not very democratic, so to speak. In a country which considers itself highly democratic, it doesn't have a democratic spelling system. And it's a paradox, it contradicts the grammar approach so much. So this is an interesting combination. Let's go to English, more spelling. I could ask you to write down the sentence, though the rough cough and hiccup plough me through, I ought to cross the lock. And you can probably guess why I chose this. It's because of the spelling of OU. The spelling of OU, though the rough cough and hiccup plough me through, I ought to cross the lock. So there are several ways of saying OU. It can be O, it can be o, ow, u, and all OU. English is, the spelling of English is very unpredictable. It does apply the phonetic principle, but the exceptions are, there are so many exceptions that you don't think about that anymore, so you tend to learn them lexically. About 50% of all English words have unpredictable spelling. English has 1,100 different ways to spell its 44 separate sounds, and there are silent letters, like in the word hour. You don't say hour, you say hour. So many exceptions, yet at the same time, I don't find English spelling very difficult, because I don't think about, I roughly apply the phonetic principle, but then I think, well, it's probably, this particular word is written in this particular way. So many exceptions, yet a system which is relatively easy, I think, personally. The solution to dealing with English spelling, of course, I've had to learn, and the reason I learned it was by not thinking too much about the logic, but just looking at individual words. You know, to say the word, to analyze the spelling of the word have would be nonsensical. It's very unwise to think about it too much, so you see those letters and you just pronounce it that way, so as individual words. And that makes it a lot easier than Dutch spelling. So there is a wild difference between the rationale behind the spelling policies. In the Netherlands, spelling should be logical and maybe even historically correct. And you know, irregularities are just collateral damage, and it happens, and the ordinary users are just going to have to accept this. That's imposed, and it's pretty harsh. In English, this doesn't really count. Polish is a very phonetic language. I lived in Poland for 6 months, and I can read this out, and I will sound very Polish. I hope none of you speak Polish. Shakespeare jest dobrze znanym dramaturgiem sprzed kilku wieków. Do dziś słynny jest dzięki słodziej elokwencji. I didn't prepare this sentence. I read it phonetically because I've learned a few rules on how to pronounce it, and now I know. And I can assure you that a Polish person would have said, well, that was pretty good. Now, if you do the same thing with English, then, you know, I once asked my daughter to read this out. She doesn't speak English. And she would say, Sahakis peare is avel pronoun, blah, 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 blah. Okay? It doesn't work that way. Another way, you know, as a phonetician, we all would prefer, of course, that we wrote it this way, because this makes sense. You learn IPA and you know how to pronounce everything. And in the past, this ideal principle was also applied when people started suggesting that we should write English like this. And can you just stare at this for a second? Maybe you know, because it's a well-known example, but can you just stare at this a second and guess what it is if you apply the phonetic principle? Can you see it? Anyone? The eyes, angel, gave the owl a ring. Of course, the TH, you know, they're connected as one sound. That helped. Ice, this is a diphthong, which is then connected, IE. And if you apply this system, to me, this is very, it's reminiscent of IPA. It's called the Initial Teaching Alphabet. The 1960s, it's experimental, it never caught on. But I find this a very interesting approach to it. But you can only apply it if there is actually a problem. And then you'd have to agree on it being a problem. Let's look at the word Shakespeare. It's very striking how in some languages, like Polish, Lithuanian, and even Japanese, you just adjust the spelling to how you say it. Now, in English, of course, this is irrelevant, because it's an English word, but in Dutch, we say this. We would never say something like Shakespeare or Shakespeare, because that sounds like Shakespeare or how we would pronounce it. And in French, you don't say Jacques-Speare. Okay? They also say Shakespeare. Okay? So some countries, they adapt everything, even names, but to me as a Dutchman, to adjust a name to spelling would be, in the spelling would be unheard of. I find that I just wouldn't apply that system. Together with pronunciation, spelling is a manifestation of linguistic and personal identity. It's a very personal thing. It touches you. People have opinions about it. We don't like, this is a principle, we don't like policymakers to tell us how to write our language. We just don't want that. We think it's our language. This is a sort of modern trend. The grammar affects the ease of communication. The lexicon affects how we view the world. For instance, the word chairperson. You change the lexicon and you change the way you look at you know, you don't say chairman anymore, you say chairperson, and through that lexical change, so the imposed change, you start looking at the world slightly differently. And finally, another principle of prescriptivism is that spelling affects pronunciation. Whereas one would think, if you apply the phonetic principle, that it should be the other way around. So we have the pannenkoek. Another Dutch word is zachtjes. There is a T there, and some people pronounce the T, which is, I find a little bit annoying, to be honest. But it's only on the basis of the fact that it's in the spelling. The same thing is true for often and often. You know, you can pronounce it with or without, and it's based on your mental picture of how it's written. And I think we will all agree that you shouldn't adjust pronunciation to how things are written down, just because the spelling system doesn't really deal with all the phonetic variation well. So today we have usage guides. I hear that in Japan there's also usage guides, and that they sell well because they tell people how to, you know, the do's and don'ts of language. There is a very lowbrow one, Eat, Shoots and Leaves, about punctuation, and this is a best-selling book. But if you put the wrong comma in, then your whole pronunciation, the logic of the sentence and the actual meaning of the sentence goes wrong. And people love funny examples of mistakes and what happens, etc., etc. So these are bestsellers. There's also a more serious one by Fowler, more like an official grammar. And you can see that the number of British usage guides has been slightly going up since the 1900s. They're becoming more popular. People increasingly like reading about what is right and what is not right in their language. There's also a German prescriptivism, and I'd like to give you a few examples of how prescriptivism, how it works, what happens and what is behind it. There is the SZ in German, which represents a voiceless S. In Dutch we used to call it ringel S, but apparently in German that makes no sense. Okay? I don't know where we got it. There was a conference in 1903 to design a capitalized version, but then in 1997, I still remember that, the SZ use was reduced. And in 2007, a capital SZ was designed, and you have the Dutch N, the in-between N, the linking N. People complain about this, so they talk about the language, they complain about the language, and I hear that complaints about the coming and going of the SZ in Germany is also something that makes people a little bit angry, because it's a very dramatic change to say, don't use this symbol anymore. It's like saying, don't use this word, the word I. It's very dramatic. Have I made a mistake? I got this from Wikipedia. Blame it on them. More prescriptivism at work. This is the Dutch pronominal, the English pronominal system, and you know, there's I and we, you, he, she, it, and they, and this is how we use it, and it works. There is, however, a problem. The third person singular reference in combination with the general pronominal reference causes an illogical, and almost, if you're strict about it, a sexist situation. So, if you say the sentence, anyone can do it if he tries, that would be the rule. So, anyone could be, it's an individual, and but it's not a man or a woman. It could be any individual, so it could be a man or a woman. Yet the rule says that you should say he there, which is sexist, and it's incorrect. So some people say anyone can do it if he or she tries. But this is, of course, an uncomfortable way of talking, as people just say he. Strict people say she, but that's very marked, of course. Who dropped his ticket? Who dropped his or her ticket? Nobody says that, but that would be logical. Now, here is the old rule. This has been prescribed since the 19th century. It was first mentioned in the 18th century. And the rule is here, and I've inflated it. The masculine person answers to the general name, which comprehends both male and female. And the example is any person who knows what he says. Any person, so that's the rule. If you look in literature, or a letter by Jane Austen, she says, everybody sends their love, so all individuals sends their love. In a way, this is not strictly related, this is not strictly referring to singular, you could say. But she very easily, and she's, you know, she's literary, so she uses the language well, she says there. She doesn't say everybody sends his or her love, or everybody sends his love. And even, especially in those days, that would have been very common. So she uses singular there. For instance, if you, in the United States, if somebody has a baby, and if babies are all tucked away, you can't really tell what they are. You say, what is their name? You can say, what is its name? But if you consider it to be human, you can say, what is their name? And it's a very practical way of referring to the baby and leaving sex undecided. So if you apply this system to the English pronominal system, if you apply this principle, then you would have this situation where you would squeeze in they in certain circumstances where both he and she would be accepted. The Oxford English Dictionary says that this there is used in literature. It has been used in literature since the 15th century by many authors. So singular there. It's common in educated circles. In usage guides, it's protested against quite fiercely. You know, don't do that. There was a survey 43 years ago where there were in England, and there were 50 items of debatable language variation, and they simply asked people, what do you think of this and that? And this was number 20, which indicates that it wasn't the most important one, but it was one that really counted. And 42% of the respondents were okay with it, especially students. So the students have now grown up, and they're the new leaders in language, and still, if you read the usage guides, it's considered to be incorrect, which means that these students who are now leading the country are actually being overruled, and the discussion has been going on for quite a while. There's also the way to refer to females in English. You can say Mrs. or Miss, and they're both derived from the same word, mistress. And the spelling was sort of adjusted to distinguish between the two afterwards. So Miss refers to young women, unmarried. It was once used to refer to actresses. You know, there was a varied use. But they were, you know, especially today, I would say not married is Miss. And it explicitly says you're not married. So in the 1980s, there were protests by feminists and people who got divorced. Because, you know, at one point you don't want to be associated with being part of a marriage, or being a woman who is simply married, is that you become a different woman if you're married to someone. You're not an individual anymore. So there were protests, and they made sense. So they came up with the spelling Ms, which can be pronounced Ms, Ms, or Miss. This is not a new thing. Many people think that it's a modern day thing, but it's you know, the pronunciation started in the 17th century. If your marriage is unknown, and because it's from the same word, you try not to say Mrs. or Miss too explicitly, and then Miss comes out, because then people don't really know. So if you turn that into a lexical item, which has the function of you not getting the information whether about somebody's marriage, then you know, that makes sense. It's old, and at one point in 1901, an American newspaper said that this is actually a void in the language, and we should do something with this Mrs. and Miss problem. Ms today is highly accepted. It's a typical change from below. It's against usage guides. The usage guides are increasingly picking up on it, and basically the people have won. And you could ask yourself the question, will singular there now follow? That's the question. So sometimes change can come from below, and you know, Ms. is a very good example of that. You can ask yourself the question, why Ms. and not similar discussions? So indirectly, I've been talking about sociolinguistic reality. When people describe or prescribe a language, it's very often based on their own competence or their normative descriptions. People have their own pet peeves, their own sensitivities when it comes to language, and then if you're an expert, you like prescribing it to others, but that might just be your typical personal thing, and that's a problem in definitions. The definitions don't always seem to represent an actual living norm. There are sets of criteria used rather than one limited set, and you can always ask yourself the question, who actually decide on the definition? Now, Mestre, in 2001, said that sociolinguistic fact-finding, so how language is actually perceived in society, is not an easy enterprise, and that's an understatement, I think. It's very difficult to say, what do people actually want? If you want to take into consideration change from above and make it happen and take people very seriously, you need to know what the change is. And you can ask yourself the question, should sociolinguistic reality be taken into consideration at all times? Now, what is sociolinguistic reality? Today, reality is that there is a generation of, you probably recognize this, of students, if you like, who feel that anything goes because they text and they write each other funny messages, and it's very succinct, very short, very efficient, and there's no punctuation, just send and that's the message. It's all about content, it's about chunks of information. And they're not too worried about all the nitty-gritty details in them, they just want to communicate. Spelling rules are, the stricter they get, they are moving away from estranged users. This is specifically about the Netherlands. And there's an increasing gap between linguists, descriptivists, and the ordinary folk. So should the influence of sociolinguistic reality be taken into consideration in policy, such that it starts to affect grammars and dictionaries, so that it's not from above but below? Now here is some sociolinguistic reality. There is a sentence, their errors will likely be in their use. Some people think this is incorrect, other people think this is not correct. Now, there was a small survey, now there's not too many participants, I must admit. Some said that it's okay in informal speech and informal writing. Others have even said, similar percentages said, it's okay in informal and formal, and in NetSpeak it's acceptable, etc., etc. There's not one bar which is really much bigger than the others. What you want is to say it's correct here and it's very incorrect there. You can't take this seriously because you don't know how to, you can't adjust policy to this. There is too much, there are too many different opinions. Speaking of taking the opinions of the people, the folk, seriously, and how to implement this into language policy and change, let's go to the Netherlands. We have a society called Our Language, and it was established in 1931. And there's a journal, it's a very popular journal called Our Language. And in a recent edition, the question was asked, good neighbors, German and Dutch side by side. So it discussed, two neighboring countries, two neighboring language, how we get on linguistically. Do we get on linguistically, or is there a problem? And today I would say that there is absolutely no problem whatsoever. However, you can imagine 1931, our German neighbors were being temporarily a little bit unkind. So Dutch people, they established the Society of Our Language for a very specific reason. And this is a note from the first meeting to come to this society. And this was a note that was found afterwards, so there's no typed out version. And it says that the society aims primarily to fight, especially at this juncture, the impurities of the Dutch language, particularly the use of Germanisms. So impurities, Germanisms. Now today, if you live in the Netherlands and you use German words, this shows that you have a very high education. This is very prestigious. You know, just say the word überhaupt and people will think that you're really smart because you know, it's prestigious. So you can ask yourself, if we had acted upon these experts, semi-experts' opinions and changed everything because we want to fight, you know, German linguistic influence, then if you, every time this, this happens, well, this will not happen, this situation will not happen again, but you should ask yourself the question, when should we act upon changes on sentiments in society? Fortunately, nothing happened. But onze taal is still, it's still there, it's very popular, but it's really about language variation in the Netherlands these days. It's really nice. So, the standard language, and what do people think it is, and how do they view it? As some of you know, I checked this in 7 countries, and I asked people in 7 countries what their definition was of the standard language in their country. And I asked this question in England and Flanders, which is strictly speaking not a country, but it's that, you know, the Dutch part of Belgium. In Japan, in the Netherlands, New Zealand, Poland, and the United States. And if you ask me, why did you pick those countries? I picked those countries because I was in those countries and I knew somebody who would help me. That's the only reason. This is not a specific set of countries that has something in common. In fact, they are highly different culturally and as far as their geography and number of inhabitants are concerned, very different. And also they are, you know, that gives you some sort of reflection of differences between countries and how that might affect how the language is viewed by individuals. So I asked them one simple question. What is standard ... What is standard English? What is standard Flemish Dutch? What is standard Japanese? What is standard Netherlands Dutch? What is standard New Zealand English? What is standard Polish? And what is standard United States English? So it's one question with minor variation, just because it's a different country. And I asked people to just write it down. And they came up with a range of arguments. In each answer, there could be 1, or 2, or 3, or more arguments. And what I did, I just highlighted all the arguments and I categorized them, I gave them a name, and I checked whether certain countries, they had many, you know, certain arguments were simply mentioned more often than others. I will explain the numbers, but a high number means that the criterion is in the minds of people. It wasn't a questionnaire, they came up with the argumentations. And you can see that the lingua franca argument was popular in all countries. It was really the only one that was really popular. So 1 in 4 Flemish people said that standard Flemish Dutch is the lingua franca. A lingua franca here refers to the language that we need to communicate, to understand each other, and to have, you know, natural discourse with each other. There's also the correctness arguments, but then you can see in New Zealand, none of the more than 100 respondents said it's correct, but in Poland, this was the main argument. Then there's a strong association of Japan, if I'm not mistaken, yes, Japan, of media language. You asked Japanese people, what is standard Japanese? And half of them will say, well, you hear it on TV. In the Netherlands and in England, it's the opposite of dialects. That's a very well-known, you know, the non-regionality argument that we like to apply. And, you know, it goes down, and you can see that some arguments were simply not used by certain countries. And interestingly, there was one that says it's actually very rare, this language. In Flanders, but also in New Zealand, they would say, well, New Zealand English doesn't really exist. It's really British English with a New Zealand twist to it. So some people feel they live in a country where they feel that they don't really have their own national language. So lingua franca, the communication aspect of the standard language, is the main criterion used by lay peoples, by ordinary users, as the main characteristic of the standard language. So most of all, people think that the standard language should be a means of to communicate as equals. And derived from this, you can say that the standard language should be handleable for everyone. It should be a little bit logical, practical, expressive. It should not be offensive. In England, if you speak the standard language, it's sometimes a little bit offensive. This may be hard to understand, but if so what I speak now is sort of schoolbook English, for British English. I'm not a native speaker, but if I go to England, some of them will really just instantly hate me for speaking English like this. They consider it to be posh, yet posh is the standard. And normal people, they don't want that. You don't want to go somewhere, open your mouth, say something, and be hated. So that is not a part of the, that should not be an aspect of the standard language. But this is typical of English, I suppose. And it should be non-elitist. Now, this is very tentative, so feel free to give your own opinion, give your own twist to this. If you take several of those descriptions from the earlier table together, and you say, well, you know, some of these aspects seem to refer to a really small standard language that's really elitist, and few people that speak it, and there's very little variation, and it's small, and for a small group of people. And others say, no, it's the language of everyone. It's a language we hear and we use it all the time, and we can communicate with it. That's a completely opposite type of argumentation. Interestingly, many respondents would say this in one sentence. It's the correct language which we all use. It's from both categories, but it's in their minds there are two standard languages you could say. I'd like you to just think about, and maybe you can explain this in the discussion. If you compare the Netherlands to Japan, you see that Japan is more of the inclusive. It has the inclusive type more. It's the language that makes us, that we use to be equal and to communicate, etc., etc. But in the Netherlands, which by the way considers it to be the most enlightened country in the world, and the most liberal country in the world, and in that respect quite morally superior, we are actually very strict when it comes to the standard language. This is a contradiction, and maybe you can tell me afterwards. So you have, from this research, I concluded that their sociolinguistic reality it yields two standard languages. There's an inclusive standard language which everyone speaks as a first or second language, mostly as a first. There's an avoidance of marked structures, so no poshness, no regionalness, no things that make people go, that's fun. And it should be completely understandable, and it makes you all equal. Derived from this is the non-standard language, and the non-standard language is then the language that contains features that interfere with understandability. The exclusive standard language is the language of the elite. They say that in England only 3% speak standard English, receive pronunciation with this approach. It has no regional or local features, it distinguishes people, so it makes you look different from others, special. It is symbolically, it's homogeneous, it makes you part of that that group of people who has no mutual variation. But the degree to which it's standardized, there is no communicational need for it. There's no need to communicate that much, that far. It's just, highly symbolical. The non-standard means that any small mistake that you make makes you a speaker of non-standard. So it takes one mistake and people go, sorry, you don't speak the standard language. You could ask yourself, do standard language designers, so the policymakers, aim to make the perfect exclusive standard language, whereas the ordinary users want the inclusive standard language? that may be the case. Sociolinguistic reality is that there is a decrease in formal knowledge of language. There is a decrease in formality. In the Netherlands, communication between teachers and students is becoming like internet speak, almost. And they don't feel that it's informal. They are simply not aware of informalities and formalities anymore. It's a reality. Because the students, you know, students at Leiden, that's the elite, and they're becoming more and more informal. Communication in chunks is becoming more important than correctness. You know, just get your message across and never mind my spelling. This is how I say it. Is the standard language then part of the spoken domain, or should it be? You know, is that actually relevant? And what to do with these two trends, the ones that we just mentioned, should be standardized. So we're at a crossroads in a way. Should we standardize more strictly and tell people off, but then create a strange situation between scholars and the actual users? Or should we standardize a little bit differently from what from the way we used to standardize before? To me, that seems inevitable these days. So let's look at the future. Some principle that you could apply is that no living language is static. A living language changes, and therefore it needs to be modernized. And Milroy said that standardization will never end. And earlier on in my presentation, I've indicated that in a way we've reached, in the Netherlands, we've reached a peak in standardization, and in England as well. And it might be going in an opposite direction. Milroy also said that the only fully standardized language is actually a dead language. There's no such thing. Language modernization is a cooperative venture between government agencies, academies, and the speakers of the language. That could be, you know, a principle that you should apply. It can't be schoolbook knowledge that you apply in the writing. Another principle is that amongst linguists there is this controversy, and you will see this at any conference. A few years ago I went to a conference on English pronunciation, and there were heavy debates on whether you should be free in letting students pronounce things the way they wanted to, or whether you should be strict. And they were all respected linguists. So there's a sort of disagreement on whether to describe or prescribe. Should usage guides have a conservative attitude, or should there be a kind of incubation period? Should we wait? So you feel a tendency, and maybe you should just wait for 5 or 10 years before you actually do with the tendency, because many tendencies also disappear, as I explained with the Dutch-German example. And finally, the linguistic market it's unclear and it's very volatile, and it's a fact. It's as volatile as it was 50, 60 years ago. Requirements for success, which we've been through, were that the standard language should be widely comprehensible, supralocal, it should be highly valued, it should be codified, there should be a consensus on who decides, and there should be an official academy. So far, this is the situation. In addition, you could say, well, we should look at sociolinguistic reality and say that language variation and change should be part of the policy making. Lay opinions, so non-expert opinions, and actual usage are important. And you want to avoid an estranged relationship with linguists and users. Fettis said that a great deal of language policy making is haphazard and uncoordinated, far removed from the language planning ideal, whatever that ideal is. But you do sense that in the examples that I've given, there is a certain randomness in it when it comes to the principles applied. Some languages, like in France, through the academy, there is some sort of denial of language variation, which is very striking. There's also the political correct approaches that are applied these days. In the United States, the word handicapped you can't use anymore, you say otherwise abled. But maybe this is 10 years old. Maybe these days there is a different way to refer to it. And Indians in Canada are called First Nations. You could be a First Nation. It's a politically correct term to refer to these people. This could all be part of the policy. The sociolinguistic approach to language planning stresses the social and symbolic context of language use and the importance of language attitudes, so Mestri said. Now, if you want to apply sociolinguistic reality, you incorporate knowledge of language variation in use, you determine why and in which cases variation is allowed, and so you draw up rules that you can apply. You deal with informal usage and register. For instance, also the role of computer-mediated language, so the texting. You should do something with it. You can't. It's the most dominant. So email and text messages are the most dominant form of written communication, but you can't just deny it. You have to at least decide to deny it before you deny it. And if you deny it, you should do it for a good reason. There's also the role of loanwords and of pronunciation, which should be taken into consideration. And you want to avoid making the language bookish and exclusivist and obsolete. When you apply rules, it is preferably a limited set of logical and workable rules. And in those, you can apply all kinds of principles relying on history, logic, and communication, and it's difficult. But most of all, you want to reunite the user and the academic. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Very long and detailed presentation. We are still 5 minutes ahead of our time due to having started so early. Next, I'd like to ask Florian Kulmas for comments to Professor Smakman's talk. Florian, please.
皆さんこんにちは。ただいまご紹介に預かりましたKulmasでございますが、幅広い発表についてコメントを提供するように呼ばれまして、かなり難しい仕事ではないかと思いますが、一つだけ何回も発表者が言った目立った言葉を出発点として使いたいと思うんですが、これはSociolinguistic Reality、社会言語学事実という言葉をから申し上げたい。それで発表者が私が言いたいことを理解できるように英語で話したいと思います。Dick Smakman, many thanks for a very enlightening talk. You covered a very wide canvas and you cannot possibly expect me to comment on all the things you have said. What I just said is I will take as my point of departure the key word you have mentioned several times in your talk, sociolinguistic reality. How can we deal with it and come to grips with language standardization as a phenomenon, as a historical phenomenon, as a phenomenon that keeps us busy nowadays, and as something which perhaps will evolve in the future. That is of great interest, I assume, to all of us here, and I will pick out a number of subjects that you have touched upon. First of all, I would like to suggest as a general approach to frame language standardization into two rubrics. There are institutions, that is one, and there is culture. So what we should look at is, on one hand, institutions, 言語的に管理される機関, and on the other hand, we should look at linguistic culture, or culture more generally, 文化. What I mean by that, I'll start explaining with one of your examples that you gave, which was very persuasive and illustrative, the issue of apple pannekuchen. The apple pancakes, or the apple pancakes, however you would like to pronounce it in Dutch. As you recall, we were shown the slide of a restaurant, of a little shop that sells pancakes. And our speaker pointed out that on the shop sign there was one spelling, and on the menu sign there was another. And he explained that this has to do with changes in time that Dutch language authorities, so the institution, decided to change the spelling, but the reality lagged a little bit behind, and so we find on the shop front, right next to each other, two different spellings. This is interesting because it illustrates the point between, let's say, normative attitudes embodied by institutions and a certain kind of reality. It is also of great interest because, in my perception, this is very Dutch. Dutch linguistic culture distinguishes itself, among others, by not just by being liberal, but also by being ready to change. Spelling reforms in the Dutch language area have taken place much more often than in adjacent countries. So the Dutch people, or Dutch speakers, are much more aware of the possibility of change. To give you another counterexample, right next door, our speaker referred to the curly S in German. From a linguistic point of view, that is, from the point of view of defining a decent mapping relation between sounds and the written representation of the language, the curly S in German is completely useless. In part of the language area, it is never used. In Switzerland, the Swiss don't use the curly S in any of their publications, and no ambiguity results. However, in the 1990s, the German language area went through a painful process of a spelling reform. 4 countries were involved, 5 in the beginning, and along the way one was absorbed by the bigger country. They were deliberations without end. In what was then West Germany, eventually reunited Germany, the case of the spelling reform was referred to the courts. 17 high courts deliberated the case, and it ended up at the Constitutional Court, actually. So this is taken extremely seriously in Germany, and I believe, at least until quite recently, two different spellings of the same word on the same front would be less likely in Germany than in the Netherlands, where there's a long-standing tradition of preferred variety, but also tolerated, but also accepted. So I was a little bit surprised to hear that you said that spelling has become completely prescriptive. That is quite recent. That is not what I learned when I learned Dutch, actually. Well, so be it. But anyway, my point is we have to look at institutions on one side and what the culture at large is doing with what institutions produce in terms of prescriptions, in terms of guides, and so forth. You mentioned in passing that you were told that there are also guidebooks for proper usage in Japan. Yes, indeed, there are. There are many. And again, this is a matter of linguistic culture. What I mean by that is, and culture on a larger scale. In Japan, there are guidebooks for everything. If you start something new, if you want to do whatever, start gardening, start tinkering with your car, get pregnant, first thing you do, you go to a bookshop and get a book that explains how to go about the business. And the same with language. Most people believe books provide the answer. Guidebooks tell you how you should use the language, and there's a very high level of awareness that there is a correct way of doing whatever you do, including language. That is not so in every country. Attitudes, as you know better than most people, attitudes towards the standards vary widely. The attitude that standards embody something that is correct are very pronounced in some countries, less so in others. A question, I must admit I didn't really pay too much attention to that part, but I believe you didn't ask, is how many people respond affirmatively if you ask them, do you speak the standard language? Can you speak the standard language? We know from many situations of diglossia that a large part of the population say, well, I cannot speak the language. It's my language, but I cannot speak it. Too bad. That is a kind of attitude which is produced by a certain kind of linguistic culture, which we find in some countries or in some language areas, but not in others. So that is another example of what I mean when I advocate to look at the issue of language standardization from these two different points of view. Look at what institutions are there and what are they doing, and then look at what the linguistic culture in which this institution operates makes of it. Are people inclined to take a very normative attitude and accept? The French actually profess to conform more than they do. They have no big problem with the Académie Française. On occasion there are some strange phenomena such as the loi Dubon, which people then make fun of. But on the whole, the attitude in the French language area, not only in France, is yeah, it's okay to delegate the problem of what is correct French, what is good French, to a body of people who know something about it. But these attitudes are very different from one language culture to another. In the Western tradition, it is assumed, and it has been cultivated for about 200 years, or a little bit more, that the spoken language and the written language should come relatively closely together. Write as you speak is a maxim that many people are taught at school, however far it may be from reality. What it really means, in effect, is adjust your speech to the written norm, and rather than the other way around. To some extent, this idea of bringing speech and writing more closely together has been accepted in the East. In the last decades of the 19th century, both in Japan and in China, language movements evolved that make that the objective. In Japan, this was Genbo-ichi, and in China, the Baihua language movement, with the idea of basically, I believe, conforming to Western ideals. But still, the notion that written language is, for one thing, something independent, and for another, quite different from speech, because evidently it fulfills very different functions, is more strongly rooted in the East than it is in Europe, and that is has to do with the language culture, which in turn is rooted to a large extent in the instruments that we use, and by that I mean the writing systems that we use. In this regard, I have an issue that I want to bring up, and where I would like to take exception to a notion that you mentioned in passing. Two things, actually, regarding spelling. One of the things that you said was, what common users want is simplicity. I would qualify that and say, perhaps you are right when we add what Dutch common users want is simplicity. How do you know that the Chinese, the Japanese, the Sanskrit users, the users of Hindi, Bengali, Tamil, and so forth, that they value simplicity? Nothing. There's no evidence whatever that this should be so. that's one thing. And related to this point, you use the notion of the democratic spelling system. That goes, I'm sorry to say, that goes just counter to my brain. I cannot really fathom what this is supposed to mean. I believe the crucial variable is the educational system. Writing system makes no difference. If you have an educational system that takes care of all pupils, then you get close to 100% literacy, no matter how difficult the writing system. If the educational system lacks or doesn't reach everywhere, then you get high rates of illiteracy. And again, it doesn't make any difference whether you have the most elegant and simplest and smallest set of symbols for writing a language, or you have a very involved system. We all know, I hesitate to say this in the presence of our colleague from the Chinese the Academy of Social Sciences, but a good example is China and Taiwan. Taiwan for many, many years has had a much higher rate of literacy than China. Even though China made an effort to simplify characters and so forth, why is this so? Because Taiwan is more urbanized, it's a much smaller country, and China is vast, rural, and it took much more time to get universal education to all parts of the country. So it's not surprising that for a long time, when China was still a developing country, literacy rates were lower than in adjacent countries using similar writing systems such as Taiwan or Japan, for example. All of these having highly complex writing systems, if we just look at the system. But that doesn't hinder or further the degree of literacy. So I have a problem with this notion of democratic spelling system. Also, you might want to take note of the fact, you mentioned English, which is, as most people who have to learn it know, is quite horrible. You said your approach is lexical. Yes, that's exactly what the Chinese and the Japanese do. There are, in English spelling, there are about 1,800 grapheme phoneme correspondences that one has to memorize in order to master the system. If you learn 1,800 Chinese characters, you can read pretty much everything that's in the newspaper, in Japan at least. So that's on the same scale. The effort that is needed. So we should look again at the instrument which is being used within a particular linguistic culture and the institutions that put these to use. Are they well equipped? Is a functioning educational system that can make it work? Or are there deficits in this regard? You said in jest, I suppose, that as linguists or phoneticians, we would, of course, like to have a spelling system that is that more or less like IPA. That would be a disaster, of course. That would be completely disastrous because we couldn't read each other's writing, maybe not even our own after a while, because it is too sensitive to speech. That's one thing. Another thing is, however, more important, I suppose, that the assumption that many phoneticians are inclined to make is that the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, is a baseline standard, that it is a suitable instrument to map the phonetic structure of any language. That is a very questionable proposition, actually. Having looked at several languages, I have come to the conclusion that the International Phonetic Alphabet is an epiphenomenon of the Latin alphabet, rather than the other way around. We tend to look at the Latin alphabet as some kind of a deviation or simplification of IPA. That's ludicrous, of course, because for one thing it has been there for a much longer time. The Greek and Latin alphabet have been around for 2.5 millennia, and the IPA is an offshoot of that, and it segments the sound structure of the language just like the Greek language and the Latin language, ignoring all sorts of things which may be important. The pinyin, Hanyu pinyin, Chinese, the official transcription of Chinese in Roman letters, is a very good example. It treats something that is an integral part of every Chinese syllable as a dimension that is separate. Tones. So in alphabetic transcription, Chinese comes out as a sequence with additional diacritic marks. That is like saying there's a syllable and there's a consonant. Every Chinese syllable is a tone syllable. That is an integral part of it, and it appears as a diacritic only because alphabetic writing forces this kind of perception onto us. We all know the Latin alphabet is underdetermined with regard to vowels. There are only 5 vowel letters in the standard Latin alphabet. Many languages, as we know, have more than 5 vowels. So why is the Latin alphabet underdetermined with regard to vowels? Well, because vowels in Semitic languages are less important. And the source of the origin of the alphabet, of the Latin alphabet in the Greek, is in Semitic writing. We can still feel that today. What I'm saying is we should be looking very carefully at the instruments of standardization and ask ourselves, what is it that can be standardized? And that varies from one language to another. In some languages it is easier to standardize both writing and pronunciation. That is especially so where the phonetic mapping relation is straightforward and not subject to a great deal of variation, as for example in, say, in Finnish or Standard Italian, for that matter. It's much more difficult in languages that have a logographic writing system, such as English or Chinese, for example, where the mapping relation is more complex and more lexical, really. So what we find is, apart from the fact that it is a huge linguistic area, the English-speaking world, we find a great deal of variation there, because there are so many thousands of words spelled in a uniform way that can be pronounced any which way you like, depending on whether you are in Scotland or in Australia or in California. I think I should wrap this up once again I would like to emphasize this point about institutions and culture, and I would like to say that I have thought about this before. I was inspired by your talk to propose this as a framework of discussing all the many interesting things you have told us. And we should perhaps learn from the many Dutch examples that you have put forth, that it is possible to have very strong ideas and feelings about one's language, and at the same time maintain a very relaxed and liberal attitude to variation. That is to say, to accept standardization can be useful, as you said at the beginning of your talk, which I think is completely true. But it doesn't have to be observed very religiously, which brings me back again to the point of culture. In some language areas, the question of standard is like religion. You mustn't deviate from it. Others have a more relaxed attitude. And that is one of the major differences, which may relate historically to certain completely different developments. And that is my parting remark. You mentioned only once in your talk that there may be economic interests involved. I tend to believe they are crucial. The issue of language standardization, when did it arise? More or less in synchrony with industrialization. Compulsory education, educating a labor force that is able to conform to a strict time schedule, observe norms, and so forth. That was the high time of spelling, of regulation, and of imposing norms for behavior. Are we moving into an area, into a period of destandardization? Perhaps. Could be. Because we are also moving into a period of deindustrialization, where other skills are more required than observing fixed norms. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。今日は長い発表、長いコメントを聞かせていただきました。スパーカン先生、黒羽先生、どうもありがとうございました。実はこれから休憩があるなんですけど、10分ぐらいにフロアからの質問でもいいです。We should actually be already in the coffee break now, but I suggest we'll have 10-15 minutes of questions. 田中先生。
日本語で言います。Thank you very much. スマックマン。今日は大変大きな発見をしました。スマックさんの、スタンダードラングエージの中に2つエクスクルーシブスタンダードラングエージ、インクルーシブスタンダードラングエージ、これは大変重要な概念です。最近新しいパブリケーションを読まないので初めて聞きました。それでこの例えばポーランドがね非常にコレクトネスを要求するポーランド語がと聞きました。オランダ語もそうですね。なぜポーランド語がそうなのか、僕はポーランド語を少し勉強してロシア語も勉強した。もちろんウクライナ語とかベラルーシ同系の言語がありますけれども、ポーランド語は一番スラブ語の中で文法が複雑で勉強しにくい、パラダイムにおいても、それからフォネティック、システム、フォネミックシステムなんかでも、ボカルナザール、母音が残っている。アルティルケンスラビッシュではすでににあったのがロシア語ではなくなっている。ポーランドは非常に古い特徴を持っています。でポーランド人はスタンダード非常に厳しいのはなぜかというとですね、いつもロシア語からの脅威を感じているからです。ロシア語からの脅威を感じて、そしてむしろ、ドイツ語への親近感を持っている。つまりロシアにいつもいじめられて侵略されてるから、ドイツの文化に、特にドイツロマンティックに、がポーランドのロマンティックの運動をアダム・ミツケビッチとかああいう人たちの運動に反映されるように、この大国ロシアに対する恐れ、ドイツに対する、尊敬親近感というようなところでね、ロシア語とロシア語とポーランドは近いですから、いつもポーランドロシア語からの距離を、保つためにはコレクトネスがいつも必要なんです。それから今から10年ぐらい前に僕はオランダにいた時の経験です。オランダ語にはとても親しみ感じているけどできないので、先ほどの話では、1931年の段階と今日の段階で、オランダ人のドイツ語に対するアティチュードの変化っていうのを知りました。その頃に比べて今最近はジャーマニックブレンド、ドイツフロイティっていうのが増しているっていう話だけど、今から10年まではそうでなかった。ドイツ語は分かっても分からないふりをします。むしろ英語に近い、英語はよく分かる。つまりこれはやっぱりドイツ語に対する脅威を感じて、プラットドイツやニーダードイツと言われるように、だからオランダ人にとってはドイツ語とのアップしたんですね。いつもこう、意識して 持つと。だからその人たちオランダ語は世界で今マイナーな言語になってるけれども、オランダ語を守るためにこのコレクトネスをやはり非常に高度な段階で保とうとするから、文法論争が実に賑やかですね。これはやはり、ドイツに対するポーランド人の意識、それポーランド人がドイツ語に対する、危機感、恐怖を感じている。それからオランダ人が近いドイツ語に対して脅威を感じている。こういう言語の話が、エクスクルーシブな、スタンダードを、いつも要求している。スタンダードは必ずしもアカデミーや国家の機関ではなくて、普通の、その言葉を話している普通の人たちの、感覚でもあると思います。ですからこれはドイツで言えばハインツ・クロッサンが書いたアップシュタントじゃないですね、アウスバウシュプラーですね。絶え間なく文法やコレクトネスをアウスバウしてないと自分たちのスタンダードが守れないという、この一つこの理由があると思います。それからもう一つ、日本人はスタンダードに対して非常にトレラント、ノイトラルな、ところがあります。これはいろんな原因がありますけれども、一つは文字の問題があります。漢字を使っている。どうしてもラテン世界、ラテンやゲルマン、ヨーロッパの世界では、フォネミックなデータを使いますから、非常に小さな細部まで表現されてしまいます。しかし漢字のようにフォネミックなリアリティを反映しない言語では小さなニュアンスは、これで、直接意味を表記しますから、フォネミックディファレンスは全然意味がなくなってしまう漢字は。ですから、僕は、漢字はいつも反対、漢字は嫌いな文字ですけれども、しかし漢字を使えばスタンダードの議論があまり表面に現れなくなる、こういう面があると思いますね。ですからこのシンポジウムは3年間続くそうですけども、今日はスマックマンさんから本当に素晴らしい視点をインクルーシブ、エクスクルーシブスタンダード、これは最初の意味ですけれども、大きなこのシンポジウムにとってのコントリビューションになると思いますので、皆さんこの観点を使って世界のスタンダードを観察するといいと思います。もう一つは、日本語ではスタンダードっていうスタンダードジャパニーズという言葉はほとんどタブーの言葉です。むしろゲマインシュプラー、ゲマインアパーニシュというね、言葉がよりデモクラティックで、権力がゲバルティックじゃないと。それで、このスタンダードという言葉を言語学の用語から追放したのは柴田武さんという日本の言語学者です。柴田武さんは、ウィレム・グロータースに非常に影響を受けたオランダの方言学者の、影響を受けた人ですけれども、僕はこれ簡単に追放したのは間違っています。嘘をついている、ある程度日本語にスタンダードが、なくてゲマインシュプラーしかない、しかないっていうのは、これはちょっとデモクラティックな嘘ですね。デモクラティックフォールスだと思います。だけどこの今日のその話と、必ずこの漢字の問題は登場せざるを得ないと思いますので、今日は非常にいいシンポジウムが 研究会のスタートラインに、この会は立ったんじゃないかと思います。どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. ありがとうございました。I've seen that people have been translating what Professor Tanaka has been saying. To just wrap it up in 30 seconds, inclusiveness and exclusiveness, Professor Tanaka stresses, hinges upon with whom we communicate, what they think of us, and in which language we communicate with them. The writing system impacts standardization. And he also points out at the last point that individual scholars have been able to change our ideas of standard. And he gave us here the example of Professor Shibata in Japan, who has been very influential in spreading a more tolerant view towards standard language. I think we'll have another one or two very short comments and questions, and then Dick should maybe reply for 2-3 minutes, but I think we have room for one or two more shorter questions or comments. I know, sorry if I'm imposed that, I know that Dick Smackman has been reading for many years the works of Inoue Fumio, who is with us today. Inoue sensei, 何かコメントがありますか？この発表について。And in particular, Professor Inoue has been doing research on this topic for his entire life, so he's really expert on that.
Thank you very much for your comments and presentation comments. I was very much impressed, and I'd like to comment one thing, but it was already mentioned. We Japanese use two technical terms, 標準語 and 共通語, standard language and common language, and I'd like to have your comments about these two terms later, not just now, because we need intermission. First, we have time to discuss later in party.
Okay. Thank you. Very much. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Dami Chu from Nanyang University, and really impressed with Professor Smackman's talk, and Professor Kuma's and Professor Tanaka's comment. And I'm glad my friend Professor Kumiko also made the comment. I have a very short questions. I'm really impressed with the division of inclusive and exclusive standardization, and I'm glad Professor Kumas also pointed out the connection with economy. So my question is, also agree with Professor Tanaka's comment on the Japanese standardization being more inclusive. So my question is whether there is a connection between the inclusive standardization and the economic motivation, and whether there is a parallel connection between the exclusive standardization and political motivation. I wonder if I expressed it adequately.
Thank you very much. The first question quickly, Florian, and afterwards, just to wrap up or to answer the comments, Dick, maybe.
Thank you very much. I think this is a huge topic that you have touched upon. My personal opinion, based on research that I have done years ago, is that economic interest is the driving force, and more often than not, not always, but more often than not, political interventions into language, into the language life, to use a term that used to be used much in Japan, Gengo Seikatsu, is following economic interest rather than the other way around.
Yeah, my mentioning, you specifically indicated that I mentioned economic motivations in passing. At the beginning of my talk, I knew that I was going to be confronted with my very local, not even Western, but sort of Dutch Western views, because I also indicated that to a degree in the Netherlands standardization is a luxury. We all understand each other, and to me the economic reasons to standardize, in many conferences I've never actually heard this be mentioned. Now it might be that it is an underlying consensus type of motivation, but in the minutes of meetings by the Dutch Language Union or the Our Language Society, this is never mentioned. Now it might be, as I said, it might be an underlying force, but after reading something by a chapter by Professor Zhu, I also realized that this is perhaps more dominant in any other country than a country like the Netherlands, maybe Scandinavia and well, Western Europe. But to me, it never really, I would again mention it in passing. But maybe you disagree that in the Netherlands, maybe it might be an underlying force.
Publishing. In England, it was a Dutch printer who moved to England, Caxton. And why did it take on? Because they could distribute, in the course of the Reformation, more Bibles when they were printed, when people agreed on how they should look like.
That's historical.
That's historical, sure.
Historically, yes. But
yes,
today,
but even today I would say, if there's de-standardization, it is because economic circumstances allow.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid time is up. I might remind you that the guiding question of this entire research project has been, is the established view on standard language still adequate to our age? I'm very glad that Imam Bukarak threw so much money at us for putting such an easy question, and it turns out to be a much more complex phenomenon. So we've just started exploring that. I think we have a great number of great ideas and metaphors to work upon for the next 3 years, but now we'll have a coffee break. We'll meet again for the second panel at, say, 4:05. それで終了させていただきたいです。ありがとうございました。
现代化它的使用和发展问题。我也要感谢这个，因为我今天是用汉语在讲，所以我要感谢荒木电子老师呢，给我做一个很好的翻译。
皆さんこんにちは。まず原先生に今回のシンポジウムに呼んでくださって深く感謝を表したいと思います。本日私が発表しますのは中国におけるチベット文字、チベット語における近代化の現状と発展というタイトルで発表させていただきます。
大家知道这个藏语呢是中国一种非常古老的少数民族语言。那么它的这个文字呢，创制于7世纪，主要是由于这个印度佛教的传入，是吧？那么用这个藏文翻译和编写的这个历史文献呢，非常的丰富。那么到了这个现代社会呢，不仅用藏文重印了大批的历史文献，同时还出版了很多现代政治、经济、文化、科技、教育等方面的书籍。那么由于藏语文呢，它不是一种通用的语言文字，所以藏语文现在也面临着在这种网络媒体时代，需要进一步现代化的任务。那么就我个人认为呢，藏语文的现代化主要解决以下3个问题。
第一个问题呢，就是藏语的标准语问题；第二呢，就是藏语名词术语的标准化问题；第三呢，就是藏文编码和软件开发的这种信息处理的问題。
チベット語は中国において悠久の歴史を持ち、広範囲で使用され、含蓄のある少数民族言語です。歴史的にはチベット文字で書かれたり翻訳されたりした書籍は豊富にあります。早期の文献の内容は仏教関係のものが多かったのですが、現代社会ではチベット文字によって大量の歴史文献が再販されるだけではなく、大量の現代政治、経済、文化、科学技術、教育などの分野の書籍も出版されております。チベット語も現在ではネットワークメディアを使用の新しい言語コミュニケーションツールとする現代社会において、言語と文字の近代化を一歩進めて展開するという任務に直面しております。この現代において個人的にはチベット語が解決しなければいけない問題が3つあります。それは1つ目はチベット標準語の問題、チベット語専門用語の標準化の問題、そしてチベット語のエンコード化とソフトの開発と応用などチベット文字による情報処理の問題です。
那我先讲一讲这个藏语的第一个问题，就是藏语的标准语的制定。从历史上到现在呢，就是藏语的共同语都是基于藏文的这种书面语言。那么藏文呢，刚才说它创制于7世纪，据说是由这个吞弥桑布扎奉松赞干布之命，以吐蕃地带的语言结构和语音为特点，运用了古代的印度文字，创制了藏文系统。那么公元8世纪到9世纪是佛经翻译活动的活跃时期，对藏语言文字进行了2次比较大规模的规范。
長い間チベット語の最初にチベット語標準語の制定についてお話をします。長い間チベット語の共通言語はチベット文字によるチベット語の書面語でした。チベット文字は7世紀に作られました。トンミサンボータが孫前元歩の命を受けて吐蕃一体の言語構造と語音を特徴とし、古代インドの文字を使用してチベット文字の体系を作ったと言われています。8世紀から、9世紀は仏典の翻訳活動が盛んに行われた時期です。
那么第一次规范或者厘定呢，主要是对梵语和藏语翻译中的旧义词汇和新义词汇的统一和规范。第二次厘定呢，是在第一次厘定的基础上，对藏语的词汇、正字等问题做了进一步的规范。那么对文字书写的系统也做了一定的简化和规范。主要是对佛经翻译原则、翻译方法、翻译技巧等方面做了统一的规范。公元9世纪中叶，吐蕃王朝崩溃以后的近400年时间，藏语言文字方面开始出现了用词不统一、文字按照各方言随意拼写等现象。因此，从10世纪末开始，在第2次规范的基础上，对藏语文进行了比较长期的这种民间的规范。习惯上呢，就称这次规范为第3次厘定。
この間に、チベット語、チベット文字についても2回の大規模な規範化が行われました。その1回目は主にサンスクリット語からチベット語への翻訳における古い訳語から新しい訳語への統一規範を整理改定しました。第2回は第1回の整理改定の基礎に立ち、語彙と政治などの、領域について一歩進んだ規範を作りました。文字の書き方については一定の簡略化の規範を作りました。翻訳の原則、方法、技巧などの領域については統一の規範を作りました。9世紀中葉に吐蕃王朝が崩壊してから400年近く、チベット語の領域には、チベット語には語彙の使い方が不統一であったり、文字をそれぞれの方言の発音に基づいて自由に書いてしまったりするという現象が出現しました。よって10世紀末から第2回の整理改定の基礎に立ち、チベット語、チベット文字について比較的長時間にわたる民間の規範化を行いました。習慣的にこれを第3回の整理改定と呼んでいます。
从古藏文时代发展到现代的藏语，藏语的方言已经出现了很大的分歧。 中国的藏语现在分为卫藏、康、安多3个方言，在藏区的电台和电视台的藏语广播都是以各自方言区的标准语进行，比如中央人民广播电台和西藏台的藏语广播是用卫藏方言的拉萨话，甘肃青海地区的藏语广播是用安多方言的标准语，四川的藏语广播用康方言的标准语广播。那么上述方言的标准语不但是为了适应本方言区人们的口头交际，而且也促进了藏语现代书面语的规范和丰富发展。
古代チベット文字の時代から現代のチベット語に発展するまでの間、チベットの方言はすでに大きな分岐を迎えていました。中国のチベット語は映像、看板、アムドの3大方言に分かれています。チベット地域のラジオ・テレビ局のチベット語放送はそれぞれの方言区の標準語を使って行っています。例えば中央電視台のチベット語放送と製造テレビでは映像方言に属するラサ方言を使用し、甘粛・青海のチベット語放送ではアムド方言の標準語を使用し、四川テレビのチベット語放送ではカンバ方言の標準語を使用して放送しています。上述した各方言の標準語はその方言区の人々の口頭でのコミュニケーションに合わせているというだけではなく、チベット語現代書面語の批判化と十分な発展を促進しています。
所以呢，中国的藏语呢，到现在并没有形成它的标准语。那么，根据中国语言文字报的报道，2005年5月，中国的国家语言工作委员会成立了藏语标准语方案项目课题组，内容呢，主要解决以下3个问题。第一呢，是深入探讨藏语标准语的必要性和重要性。第二，是在广泛调查研究、征求各方意见的基础上，分析出藏语标准语的定义。第三，要建设性的提出藏语标准语的制定和推广工作的设想等等。这个项目的开展形成了比较广泛的具有广泛性、可行性和可操作性的藏语标准语方案，为今后制定藏语标准语打下了坚实的基础。那么方案的创新之处在于形成了表述统一的藏语标准语的定义问题。
というわけで、現在全く統一された標準語というのはありません。語源文字法第550期によりますと、2005年5月、中国国家言語委員会はチベット標準語構想プロジェクトチームを立ち上げたといいます。その研究内容には以下の3点が含まれています。第1点、チベット標準語の必要性と重要性を深く検討すること。第2点、広範な調査研究と各方面からの意見収集を基礎とし、チベット標準語の定義を分析して打ち出す。第3点、チベットの標準語の制定と普及活動の構想を建設的に提案する。このプロジェクトの展開により、比較的広範に行える、実行可能でコントロール可能なチベット標準語法案が作られ、今後制定されるチベット標準語のために強固な基礎が打ち出されました。法案の新しさは、統一的チベット標準語の定義の問題を形成したところにあります。
那么这个藏语标准语方案这个项目的承担单位呢，主要是西藏自治区的藏语办公室。它于2007年初完成并且结项。这个方案还到青海、甘肃、四川、西藏等地进行了广泛的实地考察，召开全国藏语标准语学术研讨会，广泛听取各方面的意见和建议，综合各行各业人士，结合行业特点撰写的有关藏语标准语论文中的意见和网站在线的调查基础上，经过了反复修改以后形成的。
チベット語標準構想プロジェクトを請け負ったのはチベット自治区チベット語事務室で2007年の初めにプロジェクトは終了しました。この構想は青海、甘粛、四川とチベット自治区などに赴き、広範な実地調査を行い、全国のチベット標準語学術シンポジウムを開催し、各方面の意見や見議を広く聞き取り、 各業界の人々が職業の特徴と結びつけて執筆したチベット標準語に関する論文に見える意見と、ウェブサイトでのオンライン調査を総合した基礎を踏まえ、修訂を繰り返した後に作られました。
那么就这个这个方案是2007年完成，那么我2008年呢正好也是工作的机会吧，到青海和甘肃的藏区去做调查。那我就当时问过一些青海，就是不是西藏的，是青海、甘肃的一些藏语专家，我说以这个拉萨话作为你们藏语的標準語，你们认为是不是合适？
2007年にプロジェクトは終了しましたが、2008年に私は青海省と甘粛省に調査に行く機会を得ました。そこでチベット自治区ではないその当地のチベット語研究家とお話をする機会があったんですが、その人たちにラサの言葉を標準語とすることについてどう思っているかをお聞きしました。
那么这个甘肃、青海的藏族专家，他们回答很有意思。他说是这样，就是如果对外来讲，用拉萨话代表藏语是没有问题的，但是在藏语内部，那么我们的青海藏语和甘肃藏语和西藏藏语还是不一样，大家要保持自己的独立性。
その人の答えはとても興味深いもので、外の人たちにとってはラサの方言が標準語というのは非常にいいのですけれども、中の人にとってはちょっとそれは問題があって、やはり青海や甘粛の言葉とラサの言葉は違います。同じチベット語でも違います。でそれぞれに独立心を強く持っているということでした。
那么藏语标准语方案关于藏语标准语的定义是：藏语标准语以拉萨话书面语为标准音，以卫藏方言为基础方言，以典范的藏文传统文法为语法规则。这个定义显然是模仿了汉语普通话，以北京音为标准音，以北方话为基础方言，以典范的白话文著作为语法规范的定义。尽管如此，藏语标准语实际上已经开始在教育、新闻媒体、信息等许多领域发挥作用。
チベット標準語法案プロジェクト失礼しました。チベット標準語構想は、チベット標準語はラサの書面語音を標準音とし、映像方言を基礎方言とし、模範的なチベット語の伝統的文体を文法規則とするという定義を提唱しました。この定義は明らかに中国標準語の北京の音を標準音とし、北方方言を基礎方言とし、模範的な白話文の著作を文法規範とするという定義を模倣しています。とはいえ、チベット標準語は事実すでに教育やニュース、メディアと情報などの多くの分野で効果を発揮しています。
比如在中国一共有5个省区有藏族分布啊，比如在5省区中小学藏语文教材审定的时候，按照标准语的定义处理方言的难题，信息技术用的词语，全国大型会议的同声传译，以及各种有关高校的藏语教学课堂用语，播音员的发音等都开始主动向标准语靠拢。2008年，青海民族语文委员会按照标准语的定义，尝试编写了一套学标准语的教材，以供藏族干部职工学习使用。
例えば、チベット族の住んでいる5つの省都自治区で、小中学校の教材を審議する際に標準語の定義に基づいて方言の難題を処理しています。情報技術の用語、全国記号の会議での同時通訳、高校のチベット語教育における、教室用語およびアナウンサーの発音などは積極的に標準語の定義に接近し始めています。2008年、青海省民族言語委員会は標準語の定義に基づいて試験的に標準語を学ぶための教材を編集し、チベット族の幹部職員の学習のために提供します。
2006年5月，全国藏语标准语学术研讨会在成都召开，会上许多学者都支持以书面语加拉萨话的发音为基础形成的藏语标准语。比如说， 一位叫丸马冷治的学者认为，这个丸马冷治本人就是一个青海藏族，他讲的是安多藏语，是吧？他认为呢，吐蕃时期的吞弥桑布扎文法和语和为标志的2次厘定，就以卫藏话为基础，对语音词汇都做了系统性的规范，将其正式确立为法定的藏语共同语，奠定了卫藏方言在藏语中的重要的地位。
2006年5月、全国チベット標準語学術シンポジウムを成都で開催しました。この会では多くの学者が書面語とラサの発音を基礎としてチベット標準語を形成することを指示しました。例えば、ワンマーロンジュという青海省出身で、ご自身はアムド方言を使っていらっしゃる学者は以下のように言っています。吐蕃の時代、トンミサンボータは、文法とチベット語仏典を簡約することを目玉とした2回の整理改定において、映像方言を基礎とし、語彙について体系的に規範化し、正式に法で定めたチベット共通語を確立させようとして、映像方言をチベット方言の重要な地位に安定させました。
但是15世纪以后，这个藏传佛教格鲁派，它发展并且自然形成的这种西藏的书面语，逐步扩大了和拉萨市井大众的口语的距离。那么藏语共同语全面趋向以佛教书面语为主的传统的知识阶层这样的一种语体，就是藏语叫做曲盖啊。
15世紀以降、ゲルク派がチベット仏教のゲルク派が台頭し、自然に形成されたチベット語における書面の共通語も次第にラサの一般民衆たちの口頭語との距離を広げていきました。チベット共通語は全面的に仏教の書面語を主とする知識階層の言語バリエーション、超過というのに向かっていきました。
那么到了20世纪初，全藏形成了格鲁派为主，以这个拉萨为中心的社会宗教格局。那么拉萨的3大寺院的格鲁派，他们使用的这种曲盖呢，已经成为无可非议的权威社会方言。
20世紀の初めになり、チベット全域でゲルク派を主とし、ラサを中心とする社会的宗教の構造を形成し、ラサ三大寺ゲルク派の先ほど申しました、チョガがすでに文句なしの権威ある社会方言になっていました。
这个曲盖呢是历史上西藏人民的通用语言，它萌芽于吐蕃，形成于古格，发展于萨迦，定型于中世纪的拉萨，也是现代藏民族共同语，他们叫几盖啊，这个 SPYI 呢，这个他们现在发音已经有很大变化了，我们后面会讲。那么就成为现代藏民族共同语的这个历史和文化的基础。
この言葉は、歴史的にチベット人の共通言語であり、吐蕃で萌芽し、グゲで形成され、サキャで発展し、中世のラサで形が定まりました。現代チベット語の民族の共同語で SPYI、SKAD のこの歴史と文化の基礎でもあります。
但是藏文呢，不像一般的拼音文字，是一种线性的这种书写文字，而是由前加字、上加字、基字、下加字、后加字、再重后加字等上下左右都可以有字母的2维书写字符的体系。这就有些类似汉字或者朝鲜文那样的文字。那么藏文实际的书写单位呢，它应该是音节和词。所以藏字的字符不能按照字母来计算，而应该按音节来计算。这样藏字的数量就可能是数以，有几千个，大概有3000到5000个藏字。这一点和一般的拼音文字不同，而和汉字类似。由于藏文不能准确地表达现代藏语的读音， 因此目前制定的藏语标准语还不能用于口语，其主要问题就在于标准音的确定。
チベット文字は普通の一般的な表文字のように一次元的な線で書く文字とは違い、前置字、上節字、起字、仮説字、後置字、最後置字など上下左右に子音を置くことができる二次元的な文字形態で、漢字や朝鮮語の文字のような四角い字に少し似ています。チベット文字を実際に所作するときの最小単位は音節です。音節が表しているのは単語や形態数です。ですから、チベット文字の形は音節で数えますと1000を超え3000から5000ぐらいになります。この点では普通の表文字よりも漢字に似ています。チベット文字は現代チベット語の発音を正確に表すことができないので、現在制定しているチベット標準語はまだ口頭語には使えず、主な問題は標準語の確定にあります。
那么藏语方言的差异主要是表现在语音上，其次才是词汇和语法。那么据专家的研究呢，藏语方言的语音差异主要包括以下一些方面。
チベット語の方言の違いは主に語音に現れ、その次に語彙と語法に現れます。チベット語方言の語音の際は以下の点を含んでいます。
比如说声调，是吧？刚才也有专家提到声调语言。那么卫藏方言和康方言是有声调，但是安多方言到现在藏语还没有声调。再比如说辅辅音声母，是吧？卫藏方言和康方言没有，而安多方言有。那么这就是说明安多方言对这个古藏文的继承比较多一些。然后浊音声母轻化鼻音声母、送气轻擦音声母、辅音韵尾、复元音韵母、鼻化元音韵母、央元音韵母等等，在三大方言当中都有差别。
まず成長の有無について、映像方言、看板方言には成長がありますが、アムド方言にはありません。二重声母は、映像方言、看板方言にはなくてアムド方言にあるのは、これはアムド方言が古いチベット語の形態を保存しているからです。その他、前択声母、無声鼻音声母、有機無声摩擦音声母、子音韻尾、二重母音、微母音、曖昧母音などにそれぞれ三大方言の中で差異が見られます。
下面就是我举了4个词吧，来看一下那个古藏文和现代藏语方言的差别。就第一行是这个，第二是卫藏 dialect、康 dialect and Amdo dialect， 是吧？这个moon、cloud， 这个wind and earth， 是吧？这个不同的这个词呢，这个 ancient Tibetan 呢是这个样子，zlaba 是吧？那么卫藏方言达哇，诸如此类，and so on。所以这个可以看出它的这个方言和这个古藏文的发音已经有很大的差别。
それでは4つの単語を比べてみましょう。今、月、雲、風、地、4つの単語について、古くからの書面語、映像方言、看板方言、アムド方言について違いを並べていました。例えば月ですと、書面語ですと、つら、わと発音しなければいけないところ、映像方言では、ら、わのように発音するように、このように現代の発音と古代の発音の開きがこれくらい離れているということが分かります。
那个可以看到，那个古藏文它是没有声调的，安多方言没有声调，然后卫藏方言和康方言呢，就是它右上角那个数字就表示这个语言的声调，是吧？
ご覧のように書面語には成長がありません。映像方言、看板方言には成長があります。アムド方言にも成長がありません。
那么下面我们讨论一下它的这个社会语言的问题。就是民族共同语的建立，只考虑权威的地域方言往往是不够的语言规范采用的基本都是权威地域方言加上一种权威的社会方言，这样双重的参照系统，那么才可以形成一种方言、一种语言的这种标准语。而目前藏语的3大方言均没有取得权威社会方言的地位，因此在制定藏语标准语之前，首先需要通过推广共同语，是吧？就 common language， 再进一步发展为一种标准语，就 standard language。
民族に共通の言葉を確立するのに権威のある地域の方言のみを効率するのでは往々にして不十分である。言語規範が採用するのは基本的に権威のある地域と権威のある社会階層それぞれの方言の二重三重関係である、と言います。しかし、目下チベットの3つの方言はいずれも権威のある社会階層の方言の地位を獲得していません。よってチベット標準語を制定する前にまず通用する言語コモンランゲージを広め標準語スタンダードランゲージまで発展させる必要があります。
其实藏语标准语的语音标准问题和权威方言问题，在其他语言制定标准语的过程中也存在。
チベット語に見られる標準語との語音と権威のある方言の問題は他の言語において標準語を制定する過程にも存在しています。
比如说汉语的标准语，汉语标准语的制定呢，开始于民国时期，是吧？曾经经历过1912年综合各地汉语方言特点的民国初年流行的所谓蓝青官话的那个老国音阶段，和1923年国语统一筹委会决定以北京音作为新国音标准的这样2个阶段。那么中间还有一个时期是老国音和新国音并存。
例えば中国の標準語がそうです。中国の標準語は民国期に制定が開始されました。1912年に各地の中国方言の特徴をまとめ、民国初年には老国音と呼ばれる訛りの強いエセ標準語が流行し、1923年国語統一準備会が北京の音を国音の標準とすると決議しました。ですからその中間の間にはエセ緩和とその準備会が定めた国音の標準が併存するという時期がありました。
1949年中华人民共和国成立以后，1955年中国政府呢就确立了普通话是作为现代汉民族的共同语，实际上也就是确定了普通话的汉语标准语的地位。那么推广普通话呢，就是推广汉语标准语，因此中国推广汉语标准语的历程已经达到了50年。那么按照各个时期的发展，并且以普通话水平测试的酝酿和实施为线索，那么整个过程呢可以分为3个阶段，就是55年到70年是一个阶段。那么这个地方错了，就是1980年到93年为第2个阶段，那么1994年以后到现在为第3个阶段。
中華人民共和国が1949年に成立してからは1955年に国家として普通話を現代漢民族の共通言語として確立し、事実、普通話の中国標準語としての地位が確定しました。推普という言葉がありますが、これはつまり標準語を推進普及するという意味であり、よって中国における中国標準語の普及の歴史はすでに50年に達しているということになります。それぞれの時期における発展の特徴によって、普通話制定の全過程は3つの段階に分けることができます。1955年から70年代末までを第1段階、1980年から93年までを第2段階、94年から現代までを第3段階としております。
我个人认为呢，就是现在汉语标准语的推广呢，又进入一个新的时期。标记是什么呢？就是2000年的时候，中国这个颁布了一个新的法律，叫《国家通用语言文字法》。那么在这个法上面呢，就把普通话从汉民族共同语改为国家通用语言。
それではレジュメに書いていない小話を挟みます。私個人的にはその普通話推進普及は新しい時代に入ったと思います。2000年に新しい法律ができました。これは標準語に関わる法律なのですが、これは普通話、普通話を漢族の言葉ではなくて国家の言葉としようという法律です。
那么就2000年以后，我觉得有一个很大的问题，就是过去推广普通话是在汉语方言地区进行，而2000年以后呢，它是向着全国，不光是汉语地区，包括少数民族地区也在推广。
私がこの、2000年以降の法律について問題があると思うのは、これは、中国語が話されている地域において普通話を普及させるだけではなくて、中国語以外の言葉を話す、例えば少数民族の地域にもこれを当てはめようとしていることです。
所以呢，就好像刚才那个Smuckman 教授谈到有一种叫做 World Englishes， 是吧？其实这个 Mandarin 呢也有一个这个 Mandarinses， 就是除了 Chinese 讲以外呢，就是其他 minority language，minority people 也要讲这个Mandarin， 所以就有很多 Mandarin 的变体，就是官话的变体，就是variables of Mandarin by different nationalities， 就是不同民族讲的普通話，就不光是漢民族講的，少数民族也要講，是吧？
先ほどスマックマン先生の話に出てきたのと関係あるのですが、マンダリンプートン話を全ての民族に応用しようという考えです。
你比如说我们今天在座的白英文的教授，他的母语是蒙古语，但是他可以讲很好的普通话，那我们就可以管它叫做 Mongolian Mandarin。然后那个黄海平同学呢，他是中国的壮族，壮语是他的母语，但是他可以讲很好的普通话，所以我们管它叫做壮 Mandarin。
例えば、今日おられるモンゴル語が母語の先生も中国語プートン話普通話をうまくお話になりますし、チワン族の
就是close to 泰，就是和那个傣族泰国很像的一种语言。泰国和泰国语很像。
チワン族の学生も、プートン話をうまく話しています。そういうわけでモンゴル族的な、プートン話、チワン族的なプートン話が存在することになります。
但是他们讲的普通话呢和汉族的还是有区别，比如说白英文的教授的他讲的汉语的声调系统和我们的声调系统不太一样，而这个黄海平同学呢，他壮族的普通话，他的重音系统和汉族的重音系统不一样。重音press
バイモンド先生ですと、やはりお上手ですけれども、我々のプートン派とちょっと違って、それは成長です。それからチワン族の学生さんのもお上手ですけれども、アクセントがちょっと違います。
OK， 再比如说这 ，OK， 这找不到了啊。好，再比如说像日语的标准语，这个我是很外行的啊，我是引用别人的观点。那么由于明治初期的时候，日本的首都从京都迁到了东京，那么也就出现了是以悠久文化的京都方言，还是以东京话作为通用语？是否需要将全国方言中的音韵、文法、词汇应用最为广泛的部分要加到这个标准语当中来等这样的问题？那么在明治政府还没有将标准语的大致框架制定出来的时候，在东京的山手地区，一部分的地方出身的知识分子阶层的语言逐渐统一起来，就形成了与当时市井百姓不同风格的东京语，这就成为后来日语标准语的基础。那么在此基础上，明治政府采取了受过教育的阶层的东京口音为基础，并去掉了不合适的表達方式，补充了敬语等表達方式，从而形成了日语的标准语。
日本語標準語もそうです。私は専門家ではないので他の人の意見を借りますが、明治の初めに日本の首都は京都から東京へ移り、悠久の文化を持つ京都方言か、それとも東京方言を通用語とするのかという問題、全国の方言の音韻、文法、語彙の中でも広く使われている部分を通用語の中に入れるべきかどうかという問題が生じました。明治政府が標準語の大枠をまだ定めていないときに、東京の山手地区では一部の地方出身の知識階層の言語が次第に統一されて、当時の市政の一般人とは違うスタイルの東京語を形成し、これが後の標準語の基礎となりました。この基礎に立って明治政府は、教育を受けた階層の東京の発音を基準とし、ふさわしくない表現形式を排除し、敬語の表現を補充して、 こうして日本語の標準語が作られました。
那么和这个标准日语很相似，汉语的标准语也就是普通话，它虽然是以北京话为基础，但是普通话的语音、词汇、语法都和北京人的口语相差很大。它也是实际普通话也是受过教育阶层的北京口音，而不是真正那个老百姓的口音。
実は今申しました日本語の標準語と中国の普通話もとても似ています。普通話も北京の方言を基礎とするとは言っていますが、実際には普通話と北京の方言には大きな違いがあります。これはなぜかと言いますと、普通話もやはり教育を受けた階層の言葉に基づいているからです。
好，下面我想讲第二个问题，就是藏语名词术语的标准化。
それでは第2章、チベット語の専門用語の標準化についてお話します。
术语呢是语言中词汇的一个很特殊的部分，它反映的是现代世界科学技术的通用概念。术语所指称的概念特征、概念关系、概念定义、概念体系、概念定名等，都具有国际化和超语言的特征。1985年，中国成立了全国术语标准化技术委员会。那么，中国汉语的科学技术术语的标准化工作已经基本完成。1995年6月，这个委员会呢又设立了少数民族术语标准化特别分委员会。同一年9月，又成立了藏语术语标准化工作委員会。
専門用語は言語の語彙の中でも特殊な部分で、現代世界の科学技術の通用概念を反映しています。専門用語が指し示す概念の特徴、関係、定義、システム、命名などは国際的で言語の壁を越えた特徴を有しています。1985年、中国では全国専門用語標準化技術委員会が成立し、中国の科学技術用語の標準化事業がおおよそ完了しました。1995年6月には、この委員会によって少数民族専門用語標準化特別部会が設立され、同年9月にはチベット語専門用語標準化事業委員会が成立しました。
在中国参与藏语术语标准化工作的单位主要有中国藏学研究中心、西藏自治区藏语文工作委员会、青海省民族语文工作办公室、四川省民族语文工作办公室、民族出版社、中国民族语文翻译局、西北民族大学等单位。目前已经完成了7项国家标准，就是第一，藏语术语工作的原则和方法；第二，藏语术语工作词汇的第一部分；第三，藏语术语工作概念术语的协调；第四，藏语术语工作计算机应用词汇；5，藏语词书编纂的一般原则和方法；6，藏语词书编纂符号；7，藏语词书编纂基本术语。这7项这个藏语文的术语标准，全国藏语文术语标准化工作委员会2006年工作会议要求继续做好这7项国家术语标准化的后续工作，并且按照国家术语标准上报全国术语标准化委员会，以形成就是从一种地方的标准上升为一种国家的标准。
中国からチベット語専門用語標準委員会、チベット語専門用語標準化事業に参加した機関は主に中国チベット学研究センター、チベット自治区チベット語群事業委員会、青海省民族語群事業事務室、四川省民族語群事業事務室、民族出版社中国民族語群翻訳局、西北民族大学などです。目下すでに7つの項目を終了しました。1、チベット語専門用語事業の原則と方法。2、チベット専門用語事業5位第1部門理論と応用。3、チベット語専門用語事業概念と専門用語の調和。4、チベット語専門用語事業コンピューターでの語彙の応用。5、チベット語辞書編纂の一般原則と方法。6、チベット語辞書編纂の辞書編纂で使用する記号。7、チベット語辞書編纂での基本専門用語などの7つの専門用語標準化の基準です。 全国チベット語標準化事業委員会は2006年度の会議で、先の7項目に続く後続の事業を継続してしっかり行うことと、国家専門用語基準に基づき、全国専門用語基準化技術委員会民族言語部会に報告することを要求しました。これは一地方での原則を全国規模の原則にしてほしいということです。
2006年，西藏自治区成立了自治区新词术语藏文翻译规范委员会，制定颁布了西藏自治区藏语新词术语审定工作原则和新词术语翻译和借用使用规则，先后审定出版了汉藏医学词典、汉藏邮电词典、汉藏法律词典、汉藏金融词典等工具书。这些词书涉及藏语文的新词术语大概有12万条。
2006年、チベット自治区に新語専門用語チベット語翻訳規範委員会が成立し、チベット自治区のチベット語新語専門用語審査業務規則と新語専門用語翻訳と借用語の使用規則を制定し、相次いで肝臓医学辞典、肝臓誘電電信辞典、肝臓法律辞典、そして肝臓金融辞典が出版されました。これらの辞書が取り上げたチベット語の新語専門用語は12万項目に上ります。
但是不同语言制定术语的原则和方法是不同的。比如说汉语基本上是用意译西方语言的术语，用汉语的语素词素重新造词。比如说 computer 这个词呢，它就译成了电脑，是吧？这点显然和日语不一样。或者用音译加或意译，是吧？比如 internet 这个词，或者音译为因特网，或者意译为互联網。
しかし、専門用語制定の原則は言語によって様々です。例えば、中国語は基本的に西洋言語の専門用語を意訳して、中国語の形態詞を持って単語を作ります。例えば、コンピューターは電気の脳と意訳します。あるいは音訳と意訳の併用です。例えば、インターネットは音訳してインターが音訳、ネット、網の部分が意訳です。あるいは意訳して互联網、ネットワーク、連絡網としています。
而日语的术语呢，大量也是使用西方语言术语的音译，并用片假名记录，以区别于用平假名记录的一般词汇。
一方、日本語の専門用語は西洋言語の専門用語の翻訳を大量に使い、カタカナで記録することによってひらがなで書かれる普通の語彙と区別しています。
藏语的术语制定呢要复杂一些，它要解决以下的问题：第一，藏语术语的构词方法；第二，藏医、藏药、天文、历算等藏语传统术语的规范；第三，藏语方言之间术语的统一规范；第四，藏语术语和汉语、英语等通用语言术语的统一规范等。
一方、チベット語の専門用語の制定は少し複雑で、次の問題を解決しなければいけません。1、チベット語専門用語の語構成の方法。2、チベット医学、薬学、天文、歴学などのチベット語の伝統的な用語の規範。3、チベット方言間の専門用語の統一規範。4、チベット語の専門用語と中国語、英語などの一般に通用する言語の専門用語の統一なんです。
那么藏语创制新词术语呢，主要有3种方法，就是利用旧的词语创造新的詞語和從其他語言借用詞語這3種途徑。
チベット語における新語専門用語の制定には3つの手段があります。それは古いものを再利用する、全く新しいものを作る、また借用するということです。
所谓利旧呢，就是利用藏语的旧词语表达新意、新的概念，是吧？比如用传统的一个佛教术语世间来引申为现在意义上的宇宙，用佛教术语这个占卜周引申作为现在意义的世界。
すなわち、失礼しました。いわゆる再利用というのは、チベット語にもともとある語彙を用いて新しい概念を表すことです。例えば仏教用語で世の中という意味の言葉がありますが、現在はこれを宇宙という派生句に用いています。また仏教用語の 先部州という古代インドの世界観における人間が住む大陸を表す言葉があるのですが、これを現在が派生して世界の意味で用いています。
那么所谓的创新呢，主要是指用固有的词汇成分来构成新词、新的派生词、复合词或者词组，是吧？比如说藏语有一个词根是制造，那么它根据这个词根呢，加上不同的词缀或者词根呢，就可以构成工人、工厂、工业、工业国家等等这些词。那么这种构词就是用旧的词素来构成新词，是藏语创造这个术语的主要的途径。
新しく作る創造ですけれども、主に固有の語彙成分を構成して新しい派生語や複合語やフレーズを作ることを指します。例えばチベット語固有の語源で製造するという語根があるのですが、その製造するに例えば人を表す設備字をつければ労働者になり、場所を表す意味の言葉をつければ工場に、職業の意味の言葉をつければ工業に、今作りました工業にさらに国家の意味の固有語をつければ工業国家になるなど、このような語構成がチベット語の専門用語を作る上で主流になっております。
借用呢是指从其他的语言，主要是汉语直接音译比如借汉语的公司、党、茶、礼等等。那么借用汉语的另一种普遍方式呢，就是用藏语的语速和词序来仿译汉语的术语，是吧？比如说电梯，是吧？这个 elevator 这个词汉语已经翻译成电梯，所以藏语呢也用电加梯这样的一个词素和语序呢构成电梯这样一个新词。其他比如说电线、电压，还有红土，是吧？两种，大脑、低温等等。那么这种仿译结构呢，在汉语中也很常见，是吧？比如说汉语把这个英语有一个或者西方语有一个前缀叫 tele， 是吧 ？tele 呢它就翻译成电。那么比如说 telephone 呢就是电话 ，telegram 呢就是电报 ，telecom 或者 telecommunication 就是电信，television 呢就是电视，是吧？这种方式实际上也是这个汉藏共用的一种方法。
借用というのはその他の言語、主に中国語から直接翻訳することです。例えば、会社の意味の言葉は中国語の本数から来ています。糖の意味の言葉も中国語の単から来ており、茶の意味も中国語の茶から直接、梨の意味の梨も、梨から来ています。中国語を借用する上で翻訳以外にもう一つよく使われるのは、チベット語の形態素と語順を使って中国語の専門用語を借りてくることです。模倣訳とも言います。例えば、エレベーターは中国語では電気のはしごと表します。チベット語も電気を表す言葉とはしごを表す言葉をそのまま組み合わせます。電線、電線も同様に、電圧も電压も同じように、それから組み合わせています。赤土を表すのは中国語では本土を赤いの次に土が来ますけれども、チベット語の場合は土の意味の言葉、赤の意味の言葉を土赤の語順で組み合わせます。優良品種を表す中国語の兩種もチベット語の場合は品種を表す言葉の次に良いを表す言葉を組み合わせます。大脳は中国語では大脳、大きい脳ですが、チベット語では脳、大きいの順番になります。低音、中国語では低温ですが、温度プラス低いの順になります。このような模倣訳は中国語でもよく見られます。例えば、テレフォンを電話、これも電気プラス話す。テレグラムを電報、電気プラス書いたもの。テレコム、を電信、電気プラス通信。テレビジョンを電視、電気プラス見るとするなどです。
那么，由于藏区三大方言和行政区划的差别，各地藏语用词极不规范统一。为了使制定的涉及的新词术语，对不起啊，为了使新制定的国家标准中的藏语的术语达到统一，由藏语术语标准化工作委员会组织各地提出的标准中所涉及的新词术语，经过反复的征求意见进行审定， 使新研制的气象标准中的词汇基本达到了统一。也就是说，以藏语标准语的以拉萨话书面语为标准音，以卫藏方言为基础方言的定义作为基本的原则。在新词术语翻译和创制过程当中，如果出现了方言的差异，要尽量靠近卫藏方言，也就是拉萨话。
チベット三大方言と行政区の境が違うために、各地でチベット語の用語が不統一になっています。新しく制定された国家基準によるチベット語用語の統一を達成するために、チベット語専門用語標準化事業委員会が各地で提案された基準の中で関係している新語専門用語に対して何度も意見を求め、同時に審査を行い、新しく研究開発された7項目の、基準の中のポイントについては基本的に統一されました。すなわちチベット標準語のラサの書面語をもって標準語とし、映像方言をもって基礎方言とするという定義を基本原則とし、新語専門用語の翻訳と創造の過程で、もし方言によって作り方に大きな違いがあった場合は、できるだけ映像方言、ラサの書面語に近づけるということになりました。
那么，跨语言术语标准化的目的是为了促进语言之间的信息交换，因此藏语术语就存在着与汉语、英语等通用语言的协调和统一问题。目前已经开展建立了藏汉英3种语言的术语词典数据库。
言語の違いを超えた専門用語の標準化の目的は、違う言語の間での情報交換を促進するためです。よってチベット語専門用語には中国語、英語といった一般に通用する言語との調和と統一の問題が存在しています。現在すでにチベット語、中国語、英語3種の言語の専門用語辞典のデータベースが展開されています。
那么对此，藏语术语采用了藏语固有词汇、音译汉语和音译英语等等方式。比如以化学术语为例，那么用藏语固有词汇来确定藏语术语的例子，比如说金、银、铜、铁、锡、铅、汞。那么这些词呢，它用的是藏语固有词，和英语、汉语都不一样。
ここで、チベット語専門用語はチベット固有語彙、中国語の音訳、英語の音訳の3つの方式をとっています。例えば科学用語を例にとって見てみましょう。チベット語固有語彙を用いているのは、表に示したような、語彙です。金、銀、銅、鉄、錫、鉛、ミネラル以上です。
那么下面这组词呢是直接音译汉语的读音，是吧？比如说这些字我都念不太准啊，比如说氢、氮、磷、钛、锶、碘、鲁，是吧？那么这些就是藏语是基本是借用汉语的读音啊，而和西语不一样，西方语言不一样。
翻訳、漢語の翻訳で表していますのは今表に、PPT に出ているものです。これらは、漢語からの翻訳なので英語からの翻訳とも違います。
那么还有一些术语呢是用西方语言的这个术语的音译，是吧？比如说亚、告、木、女、山、东、雷，是吧？这些词呢就和汉语不一样，而西方语言的这个词的发音或者一部分发音一样。
翻訳、英語の翻訳で、用いているものは今表に表している、ものです。アルゴンから始まるものですが、これはすべて、英語から取ったものなので、中国語の音とも違います。
好，下面我谈最后一个问题，就是藏文计算机编码和软件开发。
最後にお話ししますのは、チベット文字のコンピューターコードとソフトの開発についてです。
第一个问题呢，就是藏文的编码系统。中国藏文信息化是从上个世纪80年代末开始的，信息交换用的藏文编码字符集国际标准的研制开始于1993年。当时在中国有关部门的组织协调之下，经过藏文专家和计算机专家、信息标准专家的共同努力，中国完成了制定藏文标准国际编码的最终方案。这一方案于1997年7月在第3届 WG2 会议及 SC2 会议上正式获得了通过，从而使藏文成为中国少数民族文字中第一个具有了国际标准的文字。以下那么就是这个 ISO 和 IEC 10646中收录的藏文这个字形和编码。
チベット文字のエンコードシステムについてです。中国チベット文字の情報化は前世紀80年代から始まり、データ交換用チベット文字コード規格の研究開発事業は1993年に始まりました。当時は国家の関係機関の組織による協力のもと、チベット文字専門家、コンピューター専門家、情報標準化の専門家たちの努力を経て、チベット文字コードの国際基準を制定する最終的な構想が完成しました。この構想は1997年7月、第33回国際符号化文字集合会議及び符号化文字集合会議を正式に通過し、それによってチベット文字は中国少数民族文字の中で初めて国際標準を有する文字となりました。ISO IEC 10646に収録されたチベット文字の時系とコードは、表に表しました通りです。
2005年8月，由西藏自治区藏语文工作委员会和西藏大学联合国内有关单位共同研制的藏文国家标准《信息技术信息交换用藏文编码字符集扩充集 A》信息技术信息交換用藏文編碼字符集擴充集 B 通過了專家的鑑定。
2005年8月、チベット自治区チベット語文作業委員会とチベット大学によって国内の関係機関が結集し、共同で研究開発した情報技術データ交換用チベットコード規格拡充集 A、情報技術データ交換用チベットコード規格拡充集 B が専門家の鑑定を受けました。
那么这个藏文编码和软件开发的第二个问题呢，就是谈一下藏文的软件开发。
次にチベット文字ソフトの開発についてお話します。
藏文软件系统的研制呢，开始于20世纪80年代初，这些成果具有国内藏文信息处理领域的划时代的意义，产生的影响深远，就产生了主要是两个系统，一个是潍坊青鸟华光，另外一个是北大方正，这两个就是与汉英全兼容的实用化的藏文操作系统。
チベット文字ソフトの研究開発は20世紀80年代初めに始まりました。これらの国内、研究開発は国内のチベット文字処理分野にとって画期的な意義を有し、深い影響を持つ中国語、英語を同時に受け入れ、実用的なチベット文字 OS を生み出しました。一つは、中国チベット学チベット学センターと北京情報コントロール研究所がチベット文字処理レーザー編集組版印刷のシステムを発表し、このシステムは後にイボ北大成長加工社食有限会社との協力開発により処理チベット文字組版とレーザーの社食システムになっています。
我这简化一下，好吧？那么这两个系统呢，现在基本上占有了中国这个藏语信息化市场的90%以上的这个份额。
今、この2つのシステムが現在のチベット文字入力の中国国内でのシェア 90% になっています。
20世纪90年代中期以来，围绕着 Windows 操作系统实现藏文字处理成为藏文系统开发的主要目标。那么就是我也不一一念了吧，就是已经开发了很多种不同的藏文的这种操作系统。那么其中比较值得注意的呢，一个就是中国开发了一套基于这种 Linux 这种平台的藏文处理系统。同时2007年微软也推出了这个 Windows Visa 这样的一个Linux 的这样的系统。所以这个呢中间呢是非常的多样化，是吧？非常多样化。Windows Visa
20世紀90年代以来、Windows のシステムを中心としてチベット文字の処理を実現することがチベット文字入力システムの開発の目標となりました。その一方で、2005年、中国科学院とチベット大学、西北民族大学が団結して Linux に基づいた異なった環境で使えるチベット文字情報入力システムとパッケージソフトを開発しました。
那么，综上所述，目前实现的几个藏文处理软件，或在应用层面开发，或部分在现有汉英文的 Windows 下挂接实现的。但是从这些系统所具有的功能来看，它只具备了一般藏字处理的功能，因此最多只能称其为是基于 Windows 的藏文字处理软件，而不是真正意义上的藏文 Windows 的操作系统。
つまり、目下実現しているいくつかのチベット文字処理ソフトは、あるものは実用レベルで開発され、あるものは部分的に現在ある中国語と英語の Windows の環境の下で実現にこぎつけているということです。これらのシステムが備えている機能から見ると、ただ一般的なチベット文字処理機能を備えているだけです。よって多くは Windows に基づいたチベット文字処理ソフトとしか言えず、本当の意味でのチベット文字の Windows OS とは言えません。
最后一个小问题呢，我想谈一下，就是2008年我们对中国的各种藏文软件的使用做过一个调查研究。我想就汇报一下这个调查研究的结果。
最後に、
OK， 2008年，对，调查，对。
2008年に、はい、チベット語入力ソフトについて私が、調査しました結果についてお話ししたいと思います。
那么现在中国开发的藏文软件呢，基本有两大类，一类呢是面向出版系统的这个出版行业的专用系统，主要就包括刚才说到的那个北大方正和这个青岛华光两个系统，还有一类呢是面向一般用户的这种通用系统，是吧？就包括了刚才说到的开发的各种藏文软件的系统。
国内に開発されたチベット文字情報システムには主に2つのタイプがあります。1つは出版・印刷業界に向けた専用のシステムで、主に先に述べた、北京大学法政の電子出版システムとイボ成長加工の電子出版システムがこれに含まれます。
我就不一一念了啊，就是下面这段话呢，就是介绍了几个中国公司开发的藏文系统。那么最后那个从国外流入的桑布扎藏文系统，要特别说明一下，就是这个所谓的这个桑布扎，实际是由在国外的达赖喇嘛他们所支持的这种软件公司开发的。桑布扎，就是说现在，就是前面几种都是中国国内开发的。
さっき言いました、で、ちょっと言い出しますけど、もう一つは一般のユーザーに向けたシステムで、西北民族大学が開発したシステムなどです。それと別に国外で開発されたものもあります。内蒙古の、サンボータチベット文字入力システムというのがあるのですが、これはダライラマが関係しています。
跳到这儿。那我现在总体评价一下这些软件的这个优点和缺点。综上，中国藏文编码和软件开发仍在处于一种起步阶段，当前需要解决的主要问题包括以下几个。
これから、今お話ししましたことの、良いところと欠点をお話しします。つまり、中国におけるチベット文字のエンコードとソフトの開発はまだ初期の段階にあります。目下解決すべき主な問題がいくつかあります。
第一个问题呢，就是要统一藏文编码的标准，尽快将藏文中国国家标准提升为国际标准。特别是在目前微软已经推出了包含藏文编码国际标准的 Vista 的平台情况下，更应该尽快解决藏文的编码标准问题。
チベット文字のエンコード基準を統一すること、できるだけ早くチベット文字の中国国家での基準を国際基準に昇格される。特に目下マイクロソフトがチベット文字コード国際基準を搭載したビスタをすでに発表している状況であるからには、できるだけ早くチベット文字のコード基準の問題を解決しなければならない。
第二个问题就是需要统一藏文平台和藏文应用软件的开发，在统一藏文平台的前提下，鼓励国内信息企业大力开发各行各业的藏文应用软件，从而全面推进藏文的信息化，促进藏区经济、文化、社会各项事业信息化的全面发展。
その2、統一されたチベット語環境とチベット語応用ソフトの開発、チベット語環境を統一することを前提に、国内の情報化企業が大いに各業界のチベット語応用ソフトを開発するのを奨励する。これによってチベット語の情報化を全面的に進め、チベット自治区において経済、文化、社会の各事業の情報化を全面的に発展させる。
第三个问题就是在微软公司 Vista 藏文系统借助 Windows 这样的一种统治地位已经快速扩张的时候，那么有必要大力扶持国内的信息企业产业在 Linux 平台上开发包括藏文在内的各种中国的少数民族文字系統。
3つ目の問題、マイクロソフト Vista のチベット語システムが Windows の支配的な地位を借りて急速的に拡張しているとき、国内の情報企業が Linux の環境でチベット文字を含む少数民族文字のシステムを開発するのを大いに援助する必要がある。
第四个问题就是作为中国少数民族文字的藏文软件的社会效益要远远大于它的经济效益以及软件业的潜在效益，因此政府不能完全将藏文软件市场化，而是要继续加大投入，支持民族语文软件业，为提高藏区的信息化水平乃至藏区的社会进步给予政策层面的支持。
4つ目の問題、中国少数民族文字としてのチベット文字ソフトの社会的利益は経済的利益及びソフトウェア業界の潜在的な利益よりもずっと大きい。だから政府は完全にはチベット文字ソフトを市場化することを目的とせず、継続して投資し、民族言語のソフトウェア開発業を支援し、チベット自治区の情報化レベルの向上ないし社会の進歩のために政策レベルの支援をしなければならない。
好，这就是我今天的报告内容，谢谢大家。
今日の発表はこれで終わります。ご清聴ありがとうございました。